A 9-year-old girl walks into a freezing roadside diner filled with scarred, silent bikers, men who've buried more brothers than they can count. She points to the faded raven tattoo on the chapter president's arm and says 4 words that stop every heartbeat in the room. My dad had the same one. What happens next will shatter you. These men, outcasts, wounded veterans, men the world threw away, are about to make a promise that will cost them everything, and they will keep it. Stay with me to the very end of this one, because the final scene will wreck you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. The Highway Diner sat 37 miles north of Redfield, California, on a stretch of Route 9 that most GPS systems had stopped acknowledging 2 software updates ago. The building was a relic. Cinder block walls painted the color of old nicotine, a roof patched with corrugated tin, and a hand-lettered sign above the door that read Margie's, though no one named Margie had worked there in over a decade. The parking lot held 11 Harley-Davidsons in a crooked row, their chrome cooling in the late afternoon cold, engines still ticking like the hearts of sleeping animals. Inside, cigarette smoke layered the air in blue ribbons beneath fluorescent tubes, half of which had burned out and never been replaced. The vinyl booths were cracked and repaired with electrical tape. A coffee machine behind the counter hissed and spat like something wounded. 7 men occupied the far corner. Big men, heavy men, men whose silence weighed more than their leather. Iron Ravens, MC, Redfield Chapter. They had gathered here every 3rd Sunday for the past 11 years, not because the food was good or the coffee was drinkable, but because this was where Phantom used to sit. Ronan Graves held the center booth, 61 years old. Chapter president for the last 14. His hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had a chip on the rim he'd memorized by feel. His knuckles were swollen at the joints, scarred across the ridges, and the faded raven tattoo on his left forearm had blurred at the edges from decades of sun and engine grease. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. No one expected him to. Ronan communicated in nods, in the way he set his jaw, in the slow rotation of his coffee mug between his palms. The men around him had learned long ago that his silence wasn't absence. It was weight. Mac Ryder sat across from him, 6'4", 260 pounds of scar tissue and diesel fuel. His beard was thick enough to lose things in. His hands were the size of catcher's mitts, permanently stained with engine oil that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. Mac ran the chapter's garage, a cinder block building behind the clubhouse where he rebuilt motorcycles and on nights when the memories got bad, drank bourbon alone in the dark and talked to engines because they never talked back. Silas Voss occupied the end of the booth, pressed against the wall like a man who'd spent his life making himself smaller than he was. 57. Former combat medic, 2 tours in places the news had forgotten. He wore a faded field jacket under his cut, and his eyes had that particular quality, not empty, but recalibrated, like a camera that had been pointed at too much light and now saw everything slightly overexposed. Silas carried a paperback in his vest pocket at all times. Currently, it was a dog-eared copy of something with no cover, the title long since worn away. He read the same books over and over, not for the stories, but for the rhythm, the predictability. In Silas's world, knowing what came next was a form of safety he could no longer find anywhere else. The other men, Dex, Corbin, Harlan, Tommy, filled in the remaining seats with the practiced ease of people who had occupied the same position so many times that their bodies fit the grooves in the vinyl. Nobody was talking about anything important. Dex was complaining about a carburetor. Corbin was half asleep. Harlan was staring at his phone with the expression of a man who had received a text he didn't want to answer. The door opened. Cold air hit first. December cold, the kind that came off the Pacific and carried salt and rust and the smell of wet asphalt. Every head turned, not fast, not alarmed, but with the automatic vigilance of men who had learned never to let a door open behind them without knowing who walked through it. A girl stood in the doorway. She was small, 9, maybe 10. Brown hair pulled into a ponytail that had come loose on one side, a jacket 2 sizes too big, a woman's jacket zipped to the throat, sleeves rolled up 3 times and still covering her hands, sneakers with no socks, Her face was red from the cold, and her eyes were too old for her body. That was the thing Ronan noticed first. Not her size, not her clothes, not the way she stood with her feet apart like she was bracing for something. Her eyes. They belonged to someone who had already learned that the world would not be kind. She scanned the room with a focus that had nothing childlike in it. Her gaze moved past the counter, past the waitress, past the truckers near the window. It locked on the cluster of leather and patches in the corner booth. She walked straight toward them. Max shifted in his seat. Dex stopped talking about the carburetor. Silas closed his book. The girl stopped 3 feet from the table. She looked at Ronan, not at all of them, just Ronan, and her jaw was set in a way that made his chest tighten because he'd seen that exact expression before. On a different face. In a different decade. She reached out and pointed at his forearm, at the raven. My dad had the same one. The coffee machine hissed. The fluorescent light above the booth flickered once. Nobody moved. Ronan set his mug down, slowly. The ceramic clicked against the formica like a small caliber round chambering. "What's your name?" he said. Not a question. A demand wrapped in a low voice. "Avery Cross." The name hit the table like a dropped blade. Mac's hand tightened around his own mug. Silas straightened against the wall. "Cross," Ronan repeated. "My dad's road name was Phantom." Silence has a sound. Not the absence of noise, the presence of something heavier. Every man at that table had been to funerals, had stood in rain beside holes in the ground, had watched brothers carried in boxes draped with cuts and patches. But none of them had been prepared for this. For the dead to send a messenger. Ronan's throat worked. He looked at the girl, really looked, and the resemblance hit him like a fist to the sternum, the jawline. The way she held her chin slightly raised, not in arrogance, but in refusal. The dark eyes that gave nothing away but saw everything. David Cross. Road name, Phantom. Iron Ravens. Redfield. Chapter 2004 to 2016. The quietest rider Ronan had ever known. A man who could disappear into a room full of people and reappear only when someone needed him. He'd earned the name not because he was invisible, but because he moved through the world like something that existed just slightly out of phase with everyone else. Phantom had left the club 10 years ago. No fight, no betrayal, no dramatic exit. He'd come to Ronan one Tuesday night, sat in the same booth they were sitting in now, and said 5 words. "I'm going to be a father." And that was it. He rode out the next morning, turned in his cut, kept the tattoo, disappeared into the civilian world like smoke into sky, and the brothers who loved him let him go because that was the code. You don't hold a man who's chosen something bigger than the road. They'd heard 2 years later that he'd gotten sick, aggressive, fast. The kind of sick that doesn't negotiate. Ronan had sent money. Mac had called twice. Silas had written a letter that came back unopened. Not refused, just too late. Phantom was gone before it arrived. The funeral had been small, civilian, no patches, no rumble of engines, just a box and a stone and a name that meant nothing to the people standing around it because none of them knew who David Cross really was. And now his daughter was standing in a roadside diner, pointing at a tattoo, carrying a photograph. Avery pulled it from the inside pocket of her oversized jacket. A Polaroid, creased down the middle, the colors faded to the particular amber that old photographs decay into. It showed a younger Ronan, hair still dark, face still sharp, standing beside a lean man with hollow cheeks and steady eyes. They were both laughing. Behind them, a row of motorcycles gleamed in what looked like summer light. "He kept this," Avery said, "on the wall by his bed. Even at the end." Ronan took the photograph. His thumb traced the crease down the center. He could feel Mac watching him, could feel Silas holding perfectly still. "How'd you get here?" Ronan said. "Bus? Alone?" "Yes." "From where?" "Ridgemont." Ridgemont was 40 miles south, a nothing town, strip malls and foreclosed houses and a school district that had been defunded twice in 5 years. "Does your mother know you're here?" Avery's jaw tightened, the same refusal, the same chin. "She's sick." The word landed differently when a child said it. When an adult said sick, it was clinical, manageable, a problem with a treatment plan. When a 9-year-old said it, standing in an oversized jacket with no socks in December, it meant the world was ending and nobody had told her it wasn't her job to stop it. Sick how? Silas said. His voice was quiet. Medic's instinct. Assess first, react second. Her lungs. She can't breathe right. She's been in the hospital 3 times since September. Avery's voice was steady, but her hands, buried in rolled-up sleeves, were shaking. Not from the cold. The doctors say she needs surgery, but we can't. The insurance stopped and the bills are... She cut herself off, pressed her lips together, swallowed whatever was rising in her throat and forced it back down with a discipline that no child should have to possess. She reached into her pocket again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Notebook paper, lined, torn from a spiral binding. The handwriting on it was shaky. The penmanship of a man whose hands had stopped cooperating with his intentions. She held it out to Ronan. He unfolded it, read it once, read it again. The words were simple, written in blue ink that had smeared in places, and they carved through him like a blade through rotten wood. If things ever get bad, find them. Route 9 Diner, 3rd Sunday. They'll be there. Tell them Phantom sent you. They won't turn you away. Ronan folded the note, set it on the table beside the photograph, looked at the girl. When's the last time you ate? Avery blinked. The question had caught her off guard. She'd come prepared for interrogation, for suspicion, for the same cold bureaucratic skepticism she'd encountered at every agency and office and waiting room for the past 6 months. She had not come prepared for someone to ask if she was hungry. Yesterday, she said, lunch, at school. Mac was already moving. He slid out of the booth, the vinyl groaning under his weight, and walked to the counter without a word. Within 2 minutes, a plate of scrambled eggs and toast appeared, a glass of orange juice, a second plate with bacon, because Mac believed that bacon solved approximately 60% of the world's problems, and the remaining 40% required engine work. Avery ate like someone who had learned to eat fast because food was not guaranteed. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. She consumed everything on both plates with a mechanical efficiency that made Silas close his eyes and turn his face toward the wall. Ronan waited until she was finished. Then he leaned forward, forearms on the table, and spoke in a voice that the men around him recognized. The voice he used when decisions were being made that could not be unmade. Tell me everything. And she did. Elena Cross, age 34, widow, mother, former dental hygienist, currently unemployed because you can't sterilize instruments when you can't stand for more than 10 minutes without your oxygen dropping below 90. Diagnosed 18 months ago with a progressive lung disease that was eating her alive from the inside. The medical bills had started as a river and become an ocean. $187,000 and climbing, most of it sent to collections. The rest hanging over her like a guillotine blade attached to a calendar. Insurance had lapsed when she lost her job. The hospital's charity program had waitlisted her behind 200 other people who were also drowning. The apartment in Ridgemont was a second-floor unit in a building that smelled like mildew and cooking grease. Rent was 4 months behind. The eviction notice had arrived last Tuesday. A yellow piece of paper taped to the door like a warrant. Avery had pulled it down before her mother could see it, folded it into a square, and hidden it in her backpack between her math workbook and a bag of cough drops she'd stolen from a gas station because her mother's coughing at night had become so violent that it shook the bed frame. Avery had found the note 3 weeks ago. In a shoebox in her mother's closet, buried beneath old tax returns and a bundle of letters tied with a rubber band. She'd read it 7 times, memorized the route number, counted the Sundays on a calendar, packed nothing because she had nothing to pack. Rode a city bus to the edge of Ridgemont, walked 2 miles to the highway junction, caught a Greyhound using $11 she'd saved from returning cans, and followed a dead man's handwriting to a diner on a road that didn't exist on her phone's map. She was 9 years old. When she finished talking, the diner was quiet except for the hiss of the coffee machine and the distant sound of a truck downshifting on the highway. Ronan looked at Mac. Mac looked at Silas. Silas was already standing. "Saddle up," Ronan said. 20 minutes later, 11 Harley-Davidsons thundered south on Route 9 toward Ridgemont. The sound was enormous, a rolling wall of combustion and chrome that made the pavement vibrate and sent birds scattering from power lines. Avery rode on the back of Ronan's bike, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against the leather of his cut. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't flinch at the speed or the cold or the roar. She held on like someone who had finally found something worth holding. The apartment building in Ridgemont looked exactly like the kind of place where Hope went to die. Water-stained stucco, a stairwell that smelled like cigarettes and bleach, a parking lot with more potholes than cars. Unit 2C. The door was thin enough to hear the television through it. Some daytime program playing to an empty room, the kind of noise people left on because silence was worse. Ronan knocked. 3 times. Slow, heavy. The door opened on a chain. Elena Cross looked at him through the 4-inch gap, and what Ronan saw made the muscles in his jaw harden until his teeth ached. She was thin, not slender, thin. The kind of thin that comes from a body consuming itself. Her skin had a gray undertone that he recognized from hospital visits he wished he could forget. An oxygen cannula looped beneath her nose, the clear tubing trailing back into the apartment like a leash. Her eyes were Avery's eyes, dark, intelligent, exhausted. But where Avery's held defiance, Elena's held something closer to surrender. "Who are you?" Her voice was a whisper wrapped in sandpaper. "My name is Ronan Graves. I was a brother of your husband." Elena stared at him. Her hand tightened on the door. He never talked about. "No," Ronan said. "He wouldn't have. That was phantom, kept everything locked in a vault nobody else had the combination to." He paused. "Your daughter found us." Elena's face changed. The surrender cracked. Something raw climbed up from beneath it. Fear, fury, relief, shame. All of it tangled together in a way that made her grip the doorframe because her knees had stopped working. "Avery, she's safe. She's downstairs. She rode 40 miles on a bus to find us because you raised a kid who doesn't know how to quit." Elena's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together hard enough to turn them white. The oxygen concentrator inside the apartment hummed its mechanical rhythm. In, out, the machine breathing because her lungs couldn't do it alone. "I can't," she started. "You don't have to do anything," Ronan said. "Not tonight. Tonight you let us in, and we figure out what happens next. That's it. One night, one step." She looked past him, down the stairwell. 11 men in leather stood in the parking lot beside their motorcycles, breath clouding in the cold, saying nothing, waiting, not pushing, not posturing, not performing, just present, like a wall between her and everything that had been trying to crush her. Elena undid the chain. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as a living room. Every surface told a story of slow collapse, dishes in the sink, mail piled on the counter, most of it envelopes with red stamps and bold fonts. A portable oxygen concentrator sat beside a recliner that had a blanket draped over it, and a pillow dented in the shape of someone who slept there because the bedroom was too far to walk to at night. Avery's room was heartbreaking in its order. Bed made with military precision, school books stacked on a small desk, a single photograph taped to the wall above her pillow. The same image of Ronan and Phantom, printed from a phone, slightly pixelated. She had been looking at it every night, studying the faces of men she'd never met, trying to find in their expressions the proof that her father had belonged somewhere, that someone had loved him before she did. Max stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing. He didn't need to. The stack of medical bills on the counter was visible from where he stood, a pile of white envelopes thick enough to build a small wall. He picked up the top one, opened it. His face didn't change, but his hand tightened on the paper until the envelope crumpled at the edges. 187,000, he said quietly, and they're still billing. Silas was already on the phone. He'd stepped into the hallway, his voice low and precise. The voice of a man who had spent years making calls in the middle of chaos, coordinating evacuations and supply drops and medevacs, and who now applied that same lethal efficiency to navigating the labyrinth of hospital billing departments and insurance appeals. Ronan sat in the recliner, Elena's recliner, the one shaped by her body, and watched Avery lead her mother to the small couch. The girl arranged pillows, adjusted the oxygen tubing, pulled a blanket over her mother's legs with the practiced tenderness of someone who had been doing this for so long that the movements had become automatic. 9 years old, and she was the caretaker. 9 years old, and she had already learned that love was not a feeling, but a series of tasks performed in the dark when no one was watching. Elena looked at Ronan from the couch. The television was still playing, some cooking show, a woman in a bright kitchen chopping vegetables with the kind of ease that belonged to a different planet. "He never told me about you," Elena said. "Any of you. I knew he rode, I knew there was something, but he never said names, never said where." "That was his way of protecting you." "From what?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment. The oxygen concentrator hummed. "From us needing him more than you did." Elena closed her eyes. A tear tracked down her cheek, following the hollow beneath her cheekbone where the weight loss had carved a shadow. "I don't want charity," she whispered. "Good," Ronan said, "because we don't give charity. We pay debts. Your husband saved my life twice. Once on a highway outside Bakersfield when a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, and Phantom put his bike between mine and 3,000 pounds of steel. And once in a bar in Redfield when I had a gun to my head and he walked in with nothing but his voice and talked a man into putting it down." He leaned forward. "I owe David Cross more than money, and his kid just rode a Greyhound bus across the county to collect." Downstairs, the engines cooled in the parking lot. The men smoked and waited and didn't speak, because they understood that what was happening upstairs was not a transaction. It was a reckoning. Every one of them had let Phantom go. Every one of them had told themselves that a man who leaves the road makes his own choice and carries his own weight. And every one of them was now standing in a parking lot in Ridgemont, looking up at a second-floor window where the light was on, understanding for the first time that letting go and abandoning were separated by nothing more than the comfort of the lie you told yourself about which one you'd done. The eviction notice was still in Avery's backpack. She hadn't told her mother about it. She was 9, and she was already carrying secrets that grown men would buckle under. Ronan's phone buzzed. "Silas. Hospital says she's been flagged for non-payment. They won't schedule the surgery until the account is current. Minimum $30,000 to clear the hold." "How long without the surgery?" A pause. The kind of pause that contained its own answer. "Months, maybe less. The disease is progressive. Every week without intervention is lung tissue she doesn't get back." Ronan ended the call. He looked at the kitchen counter, at the pile of bills, at the yellow eviction notice that had somehow migrated from Avery's backpack to the top of the stack, placed there by the girl herself at some point during the evening, silently, without ceremony. She had decided that if these men were going to help, they needed to see everything. No hiding, no pride. Just the truth laid bare on a Formica countertop under a light that buzzed and flickered like it was trying to decide whether to keep working. He picked up the eviction notice. Read it. Set it down. Then he called the one number he'd sworn he'd never dial again. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, low, measured, belonging to a man named Caleb Ashford, who ran the Iron Raven's central treasury from a compound north of the Oregon border. Caleb was not a warm man. He was a numbers man, a man who counted money the way soldiers count ammunition, precisely, without sentiment, always aware of what was left. "It's Ronan." Silence. "I need the hardship fund." More silence. Then, "How much?" "All of it." The line held for a long time. Ronan could hear the sound of a wood stove crackling somewhere on Caleb's end, could hear the distant bark of a dog. "That's a chapter vote, Ronan. You know that." "I'm making the call." You don't have the authority to I'm making the call, Caleb." Ronan's voice didn't rise. It dropped. It became something dense and final, like a stone settling to the bottom of a cold river. "Phantom's daughter rode a bus to find us. His wife is dying in a 2-bedroom apartment with an eviction notice on the counter. I'm not waiting for a vote." Another silence. Longer this time. "You're going to have to answer for this." "I've been answering for things my whole life. Add it to the list." He hung up. In the small bedroom, Avery lay on her bed with the light off, staring at the photograph on the wall. The pixelated image of 2 men laughing. One of them was in her living room right now, sitting in her mother's chair, making phone calls that she didn't fully understand but could feel the weight of through the thin walls. The other one was gone. She reached up and touched the photograph with her fingertip, traced the outline of her father's face. "I found them," she whispered. In the living room, Elena had fallen asleep on the couch. The oxygen concentrator hummed. The television played to no one. Max stood by the window, looking down at the parking lot where the bikes waited in the dark, their chrome catching the amber glow of a single streetlight. "Ronan," Max said without turning around. "Yeah. What happens when Caleb calls the National Council? Because he will. You just authorized a full Treasury withdrawal without a vote. That's a charter violation." Ronan stood, walked to the window, stood beside Mac, and looked at the same view. The bikes, the cracked asphalt, the cold December dark pressing in from all sides. "Then I answer for it. They could pull your patch. They could. They could dissolve the chapter. They could do that too." Mac turned to look at him. The big man's eyes were wet, though his expression hadn't changed. "Was it worth it?" Ronan didn't answer right away. He looked at the couch where Elena slept with her oxygen tubing and her gray skin and her body slowly losing a war it couldn't win without help. He looked at the hallway leading to the small bedroom where a 9-year-old girl was whispering to a photograph of a dead man. "Phantom would have done it for any of us," Ronan said. He wouldn't have waited for a vote either. The night deepened. The cold pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded. Long, low, mournful, the kind of sound that belongs to empty places and restless hours. And 600 miles north, in a compound behind locked gates, Caleb Ashford set down his phone and opened a laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard, not toward the Treasury, not toward the chapter fund, toward a file he hadn't opened in years, a file labeled Phantom, classified. Inside it, a single document, a report, dates, locations, names, and at the bottom, a line that changed everything. Subject was not a voluntary departure. Subject was extracted under duress. Threat origin, internal. Caleb stared at the screen. The wood stove crackled. The dog had stopped barking. Phantom hadn't left the Iron Ravens. He'd been forced out. And the man who'd forced him was still wearing a patch. The file glowed on Caleb Ashford's screen for 11 minutes before he closed the laptop. He didn't close it because he was finished reading. He closed it because his hands had started shaking, and Caleb Ashford was not a man whose hands shook. He sat in the dark of his office, a converted barn room at the Iron Ravens northern compound, insulated with plywood and lined with filing cabinets that contained the financial and operational history of every chapter from Bakersfield to the Canadian border. The wood stove had burned down to coals. The dog outside had gone quiet. The only sound was the wind pressing against the walls and the faint electrical hum of the laptop's power supply, still warm beneath his palm. Phantom had not left voluntarily. Caleb had always known this. Not the details. Those had been buried in a report filed by a man named Lyle Garrick, former National Sergeant-at-Arms, who had written the document in the clinical language of someone covering his own tracks while appearing to expose someone else's. But the shape of it, the outline. The way Phantom's departure had never quite fit the story everyone told themselves. That David Cross had simply chosen fatherhood over the road, walked away clean, and never looked back. Men who walk away clean don't leave notes telling their daughters to find the brotherhood if things go wrong. Men who walk away clean don't keep photographs on their walls like relics from a life they were exiled from. Men who walk away clean don't die alone in apartments 40 miles from the nearest brother without a single patch holder at their bedside. Caleb opened the laptop again. Read the final line of the report one more time. Subject was not a voluntary departure. Subject was extracted under duress. Threat, origin, internal. Internal. The word sat in his chest like a stone. Internal meant someone inside the club had pushed Phantom out. Not the road, not the law, not a rival organization, family, brotherhood, someone wearing the same patch. And the timestamp on the report, filed 4 months after Phantom's departure, then immediately sealed, told Caleb something worse. Someone at national level had known, had read this, had buried it. He reached for his phone, not to call Ronan, Not yet. He called a number in Nevada. It rang 6 times before a voice answered, hoarse, annoyed, the voice of a man pulled from sleep. This better be worth my night, Caleb. It is. I need to know who sealed the phantom file. A long silence. Then a slow exhale, the sound of a cigarette being lit in the dark. You don't want to pull that thread. I'm already pulling it. Then you're a fool, and you're going to get people hurt. The line went dead. Caleb set the phone down, stared at the wall. On it, a framed photograph of the Iron Ravens National Council, taken 9 years ago at the annual gathering in Reno. 15 men in a row. Leather, patches, faces arranged in the particular expression of men who believed they were untouchable. Third from the left, a man named Victor Hale, current national president, the man who held the gavel over every chapter, every vote, every dollar that moved through the organization, the man who had been Phantom's sponsor when David Cross first prospected into the club. Caleb's hand was still shaking. 300 miles south, in the apartment in Ridgemont, morning arrived without permission. Gray light pushed through curtains that hadn't been washed in months. The oxygen concentrator hummed its tireless rhythm. Elena was still asleep on the couch, her breathing shallow and mechanical, assisted by the plastic tubing that had become as much a part of her face as her own skin. Ronan hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, the eviction notice flattened in front of him, his phone face down beside his elbow. He'd made 4 calls during the night. 1 to a property lawyer in Redfield who owed him a favor from a decade ago. 1 to the hospital billing department, which had gone to voicemail. 1 to Mac, who was parked outside in the lot and had also not slept. And 1 to a woman named Dr. Nora Patel at St. Catherine's Medical Center, a pulmonologist who had operated on a Raven's wife 3 years prior and who had answered Ronan's call at 2 a.m. with the weary patience of someone accustomed to calls from men who operated outside normal hours. Dr. Patel had been direct. Without intervention, Elena's disease would continue its advance. The lung tissue was degrading. The surgery window was narrowing. Every week of delay was permanent damage. How much time? Ronan had asked. If the surgery happens within the next month, her chances are good. 70, maybe 75% recovery. If it doesn't, she'd paused. The pause of a doctor choosing between honesty and mercy. 6 months. Maybe 8, but the quality of those months won't be what you want to hear. Ronan had hung up and sat in the dark kitchen listening to Elena breathe through a machine. Now, in the thin morning light, Avery appeared in the hallway. She'd slept in her clothes. Her hair was pressed flat on one side. She looked at Ronan at the kitchen table, looked at her mother on the couch, and walked to the counter without a word. She opened a cabinet, took out a box of cereal, poured it into a bowl, added no milk because there was no milk, and sat down across from him. She ate dry cereal with her fingers, 1 piece at a time, and watched him with her father's eyes. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "Are you going to help us?" Ronan looked at her. The directness of the question had no softness in it, no childlike hope or pleading. It was the question of someone who had already been let down enough times to know that promises meant nothing until they were performed. "Yes." "How?" "I don't know yet, but yes." Avery ate another piece of cereal, chewed slowly, then, "People say that. Teachers, social workers, the lady at the hospital with the clipboard. They all say yes and then they don't come back. I'm not those people." "How do I know that?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. He picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, set it down again. Then he pulled back the sleeve of his left arm and showed her the raven tattoo. "Your father sat in the same chair you're sitting in. Different kitchen, same conversation. He asked me the same question when he first prospected in. How do I know you'll have my back?" "You know what I told him?" Avery shook her head. "I said, you don't. Not yet, but you will." And he did. For 12 years he did. Avery looked at the tattoo, then at Ronan's face. Then she went back to eating her cereal, and something in her shoulders, a tension that lived there like a second skeleton, loosened by a fraction of a degree. Mac came upstairs at 7:30, carrying a bag of groceries he'd driven to a gas station to buy. Milk, bread, peanut butter, bananas, a bag of apples, and a 6-pack of orange juice. He moved through the kitchen with a strange delicacy for a man his size, putting things away in cabinets that were mostly empty, filling a refrigerator that held nothing but condiment packets and a half-empty bottle of children's cough syrup. He didn't speak. Avery watched him with the cautious fascination of someone observing a grizzly bear perform domestic tasks. When he finished, he crouched down to her level, his knees popping like gunshots, and held out a banana. "Breakfast of champions," he said. "I already ate cereal." That wasn't breakfast. That was sadness in a bowl. Eat the banana. Avery took it. Something that might have been a smile crossed her face, but didn't quite commit. Silas arrived at 8 with a folder of paperwork. He'd been up since 5, making calls from the parking lot, working the phone with the relentless precision of a man who understood that bureaucracy was just another battlefield, and the weapon was patience. He spread the papers on the kitchen table while Elena sat in her recliner, awake now, oxygen tubing in place, watching these strangers organize her catastrophe into neat stacks. "Medical bills here," Silas said, his voice calm and methodical. "Eviction documents here. Insurance correspondence here. I've spoken with the hospital's financial assistance office. There's a program. It requires proof of income below the federal poverty line, which you qualify for. I've started the application. We need tax returns from the last 2 years and a letter from your previous employer confirming termination." Elena stared at the organized piles. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was dry. "You did all this since last night?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Silas looked up from the papers. His eyes, those recalibrated, overexposed eyes, held hers for a long moment. "Because your husband pulled me out of a ditch on Highway 99 at 3 in the morning 12 years ago. I was drunk. I was going to ride into a bridge abutment. Phantom found me, took my keys, drove me to a motel, sat in a chair by the door all night, and never told a single soul. Not Ronan, not Mac, nobody." He paused. "He didn't save my life to get something out of it. He saved it because he was the kind of man who couldn't ride past someone in trouble. I've been trying to be that man ever since. Most days I fail. Today, I'm not going to." Elena covered her mouth with her hand. Her shoulders shook once. Then she straightened, pulled the oxygen tubing tighter, and looked at the papers. "What do you need me to sign?" By noon, Ronan had assembled the chapter. Not at the diner, at the clubhouse in Redfield, a converted warehouse on the industrial edge of town with a corrugated steel roof and a yard full of motorcycle parts and oil-stained concrete. The main room held a long wooden table scarred with cigarette burns and knife marks and ring stains from 1,000 bottles. 11 men sat around it. Ronan stood at the head. He told them everything. The girl, the mother, the disease, the bills, the eviction, the note Phantom had written. And then he told them what he'd done, the call to Caleb, the authorization of the hardship fund without a chapter vote. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the diner quiet. This was the quiet of men calculating consequences. Deck spoke first. 44, road captain, a man built like a fire hydrant with a temper that matched. "You pulled the fund without a vote. You know what National's going to do." "I know. They'll sanction the chapter. Could freeze our accounts, could pull charters." "I know, Dex." "And you did it anyway." "I did." Dex leaned back, crossed his arms. His jaw worked side to side like he was chewing on something that wouldn't break down. "Because of Phantom. Because of Phantom's kid." Phantom left Ronan. He walked out, turned in his cut. That was his choice. The words landed on the table like a dropped wrench. Several men shifted in their seats. Harlan, who'd been staring at the wood grain, looked up. Corbin, half asleep at the diner yesterday, was now fully alert and deeply uncomfortable. Ronan placed both hands on the table, leaned forward. His daughter rode a bus 40 miles in December wearing her mother's jacket because a dead man told her we'd help. She walked into a room full of strangers and asked for nothing except what Phantom promised her we'd give. "And you want to talk about charter protocol?" "I want to talk about reality," Dex said. "Sentiment doesn't keep the lights on, Ronan. We've got our own bills, our own problems. Tommy's wife needs knee surgery. Corbin's behind on child support. And you just emptied the fund. For a brother. For a dead brother who left." The table held its breath. Ronan straightened. His eyes locked on Dex with a pressure that made the air between them dense. Say that again. Dex didn't. He knew the line. Every man in the room knew the line. It was the difference between disagreement and disrespect, and Dex, for all his bluntness, understood that crossing it with Ronan Graves was not a miscalculation you made twice. The silence stretched. Then Mac's voice, low and steady from the far end of the table. I'm in, whatever it costs. Silas. In. Harlan, after a moment. In. Tommy, rubbing his face with both hands. In. But Dex isn't wrong about the money. One by one, they went around the table. 9 in favor. Dex abstained. Corbin voted yes, but wouldn't meet Ronan's eyes. It wasn't unanimous. It didn't need to be. But the fracture was there. A hairline crack in the foundation that Ronan could feel beneath his boots, like the first tremor before a quake. He dismissed them. Watched them file out into the cold yard where their bikes waited. Listened to the engines fire. 1, 2, 3. The staggered ignition of a brotherhood that was holding together by habit as much as conviction. Mac lingered. Dex is going to be a problem, Mac said. Dex is always a problem. That's why I keep him close. This is different. He's not just pushing back, he's scared. Of what? Of Victor Hale finding out you went off book. Ronan looked at Mac. The big man stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, his breath clouding in the cold, his expression unreadable beneath the beard. Why would Dex care what Hale thinks? Mac didn't answer, but his eyes said something his mouth refused to shape, and Ronan felt the floor beneath his understanding shift by an inch. Mac. I'm not saying anything, Ronan. I'm saying be careful. That's all. He walked to his bike, kicked it to life. The engine roared and settled into that deep, rolling idle that sounded like a pulse. He pulled out of the yard without looking back. Ronan stood alone in the cold. The clubhouse door was open behind him, spilling yellow light onto the concrete. He could smell coffee and cigarette smoke and old leather. The smell of every decision he'd ever made, good and bad, compressed into a single olfactory signature that was as familiar to him as his own sweat. His phone buzzed. Caleb. We need to talk, not on the phone. About the fund? About Phantom. I'm driving down tonight. I'll be there by morning. Don't go anywhere. And Ronan... What? Don't talk to Hale. Don't call him. Don't answer if he calls. Just don't. Not until I get there. The line went dead. Ronan stared at the phone. In 14 years as chapter president, Caleb Ashford had never driven 600 miles for a conversation. Caleb communicated in wire transfers and spreadsheets and terse emails with no subject lines. He was not a man who moved through physical space when digital space would suffice. Something was wrong, something bigger than a hardship fund and a charter violation. He went inside, locked the door, sat at the scarred table where his brothers had just voted and where the ghost of their disagreement still hung in the air like residual smoke. He pulled out the Polaroid. Phantom and Ronan. 2 men laughing in sunlight. The crease down the center had been pressed so many times that the image was splitting, the 2 figures beginning to separate, the paper thinning along the fold line, threatening to become 2 photographs instead of 1. He remembered the day it was taken. Summer of 2011, after a ride up the coast that had lasted 3 days and ended at a bar in Mendocino, where they'd drunk too much and argued about nothing and fallen asleep on the beach and woken up sunburned and laughing. Phantom had been different that summer, lighter. There was a woman, Elena, though Ronan didn't know her name yet, and the weight that Phantom usually carried had lifted enough to let the man underneath show through. That was the Phantom who had saved Silas, who had put his bike between Ronan and a truck, who had talked a man into putting down a gun with nothing but his voice and the particular authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore could not be threatened. That Phantom had not walked away from the Brotherhood. Ronan had always known this somewhere beneath the story he told himself. The story the whole chapter told itself. The comfortable narrative of a man choosing family over the road. Noble, clean, unimpeachable. A story no one questioned because questioning it would require admitting that they'd failed him. Forced out. Under duress. Internal threat. Ronan's phone rang. Not Caleb. Not Mac. Victor Hale. The number glowed on the screen like a warning light on a dashboard. Steady, patient, impossible to ignore. Caleb had told him not to answer. Caleb had been specific. Ronan watched it ring. 4 times. 5. 6. The voicemail caught it. A moment later, a text arrived. Heard you're spending money that isn't yours, Ronan. Let's talk about that. And about the girl. About the girl. Ronan read the text 3 times. The words, the girl, sat in his gut like a swallowed razor. Victor Hale, 600 miles away in a compound behind the Oregon border, already knew about Avery. Already knew about the fund. Already knew enough to reference a 9-year-old child in a text message that carried the unmistakable cadence of a threat wrapped in politeness. How? The answer arrived in Ronan's mind before he could stop it. Someone at the table today. Someone who had sat in this room, listened to the story, voted, and then picked up a phone and called National. Dex. Or Corbin, who hadn't met his eyes. Or someone else. Someone whose loyalty ran through channels Ronan couldn't see. He set the phone face down on the table, pressed his palms flat against the scarred wood, felt the grain beneath his fingerprints, the ridges and grooves worn into the surface by years of bottles and elbows and fists and cards and grief. The clubhouse was silent. The engines outside had all gone. The yard was empty. The cold pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Hale. I knew David Cross better than you did. There are things about him you never learned. Things he kept from the chapter. Things that, if they came out, would make that little girl's life considerably more complicated. Ronan read it. Read it again. Then he stood up, walked to the bathroom at the back of the clubhouse, and vomited into the sink. Not from fear. From the sudden, vertigo-inducing understanding that the story he'd been living inside for 10 years, the story of Phantom, of the Brotherhood, of what they were and what they meant, had a trap door in it that he'd never seen, and someone had just opened it. He washed his face, looked at himself in the cracked mirror above the sink. 61 years old, lines carved into his skin like roots on a map, each one a road taken, a choice made, a year survived. His eyes were bloodshot, and the skin beneath them was dark and loose. He looked like exactly what he was, a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. He dried his face, walked back to the table, picked up the phone, typed a reply. Whatever you think you know about Phantom, I'm going to find out. And whatever you think you can do to that girl, you're going to have to come through me. He sent it, set the phone down, waited. The reply came in 9 seconds. I was hoping you'd say that. 40 miles south in the apartment in Ridgemont, Avery sat on the floor of her bedroom with a shoebox between her knees. The shoebox from her mother's closet, the one where she'd found the note. She'd been through it once before, quickly, searching only for the piece of paper that would lead her to the diner. Now she went through it slowly. Letters. A dozen of them, written in different hands. Road names instead of real names on the return addresses. Wraith, Clutch, Tombstone, names that sounded like warnings. She couldn't read most of them. The handwriting was too rough, the language too coded, full of references she didn't understand. But one envelope was different. It was sealed, never opened. Addressed to David Cross in precise, angular handwriting. No return address, no road name. Just a single line written on the back of the envelope in the same hand. Open this if they come for you. The envelope was heavy. Something was inside it besides paper. Avery held it up to the light. She could see the dark outline of a small object. Flat, rectangular, the size of a credit card. She looked at the bedroom door. She could hear the oxygen concentrator humming in the living room. Could hear Silas's voice on the phone in the hallway, quiet and precise. Could hear the heavy footsteps of a man named Mac moving through the kitchen. She slid her finger under the flap. Inside, a folded letter and a USB drive. The letter was short. 3 lines. The handwriting matched the envelope. David, if you're reading this, it means Hale made his move. Everything is on the drive, names, dates, accounts. Use it, or they'll bury you like they buried the others. G. Avery didn't know who G was, didn't know what names and dates and accounts meant, didn't understand the word bury in any context other than the one she'd already lived through. But she understood the shape of it, the way adults hid things, the way secrets lived in shoeboxes and sealed envelopes, and the spaces between what people said and what they meant. She put the USB drive in her pocket. She put the letter back in the envelope. She closed the shoebox and slid it under her bed. Then she walked to the living room, sat on the couch beside her sleeping mother, and waited for the man with the raven tattoo to come back and tell her what happened next. She didn't know that 300 miles north, a man named Caleb Ashford was driving through the dark with a file on his passenger seat that would set the Iron Ravens on fire. She didn't know that 600 miles beyond that, a man named Victor Hale was pouring bourbon in a room full of men who answered to no one and feared nothing except the truth. And she didn't know that the small plastic rectangle in her pocket, lighter than a coin, smaller than her thumb, contained enough evidence to dismantle everything. She was 9 years old, and she was holding a bomb. Caleb Ashford arrived at the Redfield clubhouse at 4:47 in the morning. Ronan heard the car before he saw it. Not a motorcycle, a car, a black Ford pickup with Nevada plates, and 600 miles of highway grime coating the wheel wells. The engine cut. A door opened and closed. Boots on concrete. Then 3 knocks on the clubhouse door. Measured, deliberate, the knocks of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say for the entire drive and still wasn't sure he had the words right. Ronan opened the door. Caleb stood under the single security light, his face carved by shadow and fatigue. He was 58, lean in the way that men who forget to eat become lean, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a manila folder pressed against his chest like body armor. His cut was clean. Caleb always kept his cut clean, a habit that annoyed the road riders who considered grease and weather stains a form of credential. His eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the eyes of a man who had been staring at a road for 10 hours and a screen for 2 hours before that. He didn't say hello. He walked past Ronan into the clubhouse, set the folder on the scarred table, and stood there with both hands flat on either side of it, head down, breathing like he'd climbed stairs instead of driven a truck. "Coffee," he said. Ronan made coffee. The machine in the clubhouse was ancient, a drip pot with a cracked carafe and a heating element that took 9 minutes to produce anything drinkable. Neither man spoke during those 9 minutes. Caleb stood at the table. Ronan leaned against the counter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, the first gray suggestion of dawn pressed against the windows, turning the yard into a landscape of dark shapes. Motorcycle frames, oil drums, a chain-link fence with frost forming on the wire. The coffee finished. Ronan poured 2 mugs, set one in front of Caleb, sat down across from him. Talk. Caleb opened the folder. Inside, photocopied documents, bank statements, a printed email chain, and a single photograph. He spread them across the table in an order that suggested he had arranged them during the drive. A sequence, a timeline, a story told in paper. "Phantom didn't leave the club," Caleb said. His voice was flat, stripped of inflection, the voice of a man delivering a field report. "He was forced out. By Victor Hale." "I got that much from your call." "Why?" "Because Phantom found something." Caleb tapped the bank statements. "These are records from the Iron Ravens National Treasury. The Central Fund, dues, fundraiser revenue, chapter contributions, everything that flows up to national and gets redistributed. I manage the chapter-level books, but the national accounts are controlled by Hale's office. Always have been." "And?" "And for the past 12 years, roughly $400,000 has been diverted, skimmed, moved into accounts that don't appear in any official ledger, shell companies registered in Nevada and Idaho, names on the paperwork that don't belong to anyone in the club." Ronan looked at the bank statements, columns of numbers highlighted in yellow, transfer dates, account numbers. The math was beyond him in specifics, but the shape was clear. Money moving sideways through channels designed to be invisible. Hale's been stealing from the club. Not stealing. Stealing implies he's taking it for himself. It's worse than that. Caleb pulled out the email chain. "These are communications between Hale and a man named Marcus Devlin, real estate developer out of Reno. Devlin's company has been buying land, foreclosed properties, abandoned commercial lots, distressed residential parcels, dozens of them over the past decade, all purchased through the shell companies funded by the diverted treasury money. He's laundering. He's building. Hale and Devlin are partners. The club's money goes in dirty, comes out as real estate equity. Clean, appreciating, untouchable, and none of it, not a single property, not a single dollar of appreciation, flows back to the club. It's a private empire built on the backs of every brother who ever paid dues. Ronan stared at the papers. His coffee sat untouched. The steam rose and dissipated in the cold air of the clubhouse. Phantom found this. Phantom was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Quiet, yes. Invisible, yes. But the man noticed things. Small things. Discrepancies in the numbers at national meetings. Contributions that didn't match the disbursements. He started asking questions, carefully, slowly, the way Phantom did everything, without noise. And Hale found out. Caleb nodded. Hale found out, and instead of killing him, which would have raised questions, started an investigation, he did something smarter. He manufactured a reason for Phantom to leave, made it look voluntary, convinced the National Council that David Cross was a liability, that his civilian attachments, meaning Elena, made him a security risk, got enough votes to issue a quiet ultimatum, walk away clean, or face a tribunal on fabricated charges. What charges? Informant activity. Hale told the council that Phantom had been in contact with federal law enforcement. The word hit Ronan like a truck. Informant. In the world they lived in, there was no accusation more lethal, no charge more impossible to survive. The mere suggestion of it, even unproven, even withdrawn, was a stain that never washed out. A man accused of being an informant could be stripped, beaten, exiled, or worse. The fact that Phantom had been allowed to walk away with his life suggested that Hale had calculated the optics carefully. A quiet departure was cleaner than a violent one, and dead men attracted investigators. It was a lie, Ronan said, not a question. Complete fabrication. Phantom never talked to anyone. He was trying to handle it internally, bring the evidence to the council himself, force an audit. But Hale got ahead of him. Caleb paused. His fingers pressed against the table hard enough to whiten at the tips. And here's the part that's going to break you, Ronan. Phantom came to you first. The room tilted. What? Before the council, before the ultimatum. Phantom tried to bring it to you. He came to you with concerns about the national treasury. Do you remember? Ronan's memory was a dark hallway lined with closed doors. He reached for the right one and found it. Not locked, just stuck. A conversation. Late night. The diner, probably. Phantom sitting across from him, quieter than usual, which was saying something. Words that Ronan had heard but not listened to. Something about numbers. Something about accounts that didn't add up. And Ronan, tired, distracted, buried in chapter business, had told him to drop it, had said something dismissive, something about not poking National with a stick unless you wanted to get bit. He'd told Phantom to let it go. The memory surfaced fully now, sharp and bright and unbearable. Phantom's face across the table, the slight tightening around his eyes when Ronan dismissed him. The way he'd nodded, not in agreement, but in the particular way a man nods when he realizes he's alone. I told him to drop it, Ronan said. His voice was barely audible. You did. He came to me, and I told him to drop it. Yes. Ronan put his hands over his face, pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw pressure patterns, red and black constellations blooming in the dark. His chest felt like something had been removed from it. Not a weight added, a structure subtracted. A load-bearing wall pulled out of a building that was now trying to figure out how to remain standing. So when Hale moved against him, Phantom had no allies, no one who'd heard his evidence, no one who'd back him in a council challenge. He was alone, and Hale knew it because you, his closest brother, his chapter president, had already turned him away. The silence that followed was the worst silence Ronan had ever inhabited. Worse than hospitals, worse than funerals, worse than the silence after gunshots, when the world holds its breath and waits to see who's still standing. This silence was the sound of a man discovering that the worst thing he'd ever done wasn't the thing he'd always thought it was. It wasn't the fights, wasn't the years of hard living, wasn't the damage he'd done to himself and others in the name of the road. It was a conversation in a diner where he told a man who trusted him to stop talking. How long have you known this? Ronan asked. I found the file last night, after you called about the hardship fund. But I've suspected pieces of it, not the whole picture, for years. The numbers never sat right. I raised it with Hale's office twice. Both times I was told the audits were clean and to focus on my own chapters. And you let it go. Caleb met his eyes. We all let it go, Ronan. Every one of us. Because the alternative was admitting that the man at the top of this organization, the man we trusted with everything, was a thief. And none of us wanted to be the one who said it out loud. The dawn was coming. Gray light spilled through the clubhouse windows, washing the interior in the colorless palette of early morning. The papers on the table looked different in this light. More official, more permanent, less like allegations and more like evidence. Ronan picked up the photograph from the folder. He hadn't looked at it yet. It showed a building, a commercial property recently constructed, glass and steel, with a sign that read, Devlin Partners Development Group. In front of it, two men shaking hands. One was a stranger, heavy-set, expensive suit, the groomed confidence of money. The other was Victor Hale, smiling. The kind of smile Ronan had never seen on Hale's face in any club context. Relaxed, proprietary, the smile of a man admiring something he owned. Where is Hale now? Ronan asked. Oregon compound, but he's not staying there. I have contacts at the Nevada chapter. Word is Hale is mobilizing. After your text last night, the one where you told him you'd find out the truth, he started making calls, pulling in loyalists, riders from the Nevada, Idaho, and Oregon chapters, men who owe him or fear him. How many? Enough. Ronan set the photograph down. He's coming here. He's coming for the girl, Ronan, that text he sent you. Things about Phantom that would make the girl's life more complicated. He's not talking about reputation. He's talking about evidence. Phantom kept copies. He had to have. A man that careful doesn't discover a $500,000 fraud and not keep proof. Ronan went still. His mind moved backward through the last 24 hours. The girl, the shoebox, the apartment in Ridgemont. The way Avery had gone through her mother's closet before making the trip to the diner. The way she'd carried that photograph and that note like they were the most important objects in the world. What else was in that shoebox? His phone rang. Mac. Ronan, we've got a problem. What kind? Dex didn't go home last night. His bike's not at his place. His phone goes straight to voicemail. Ronan closed his eyes. And there's something else, Mac continued. His voice had dropped into the register he used when the news was the kind that changed the shape of a day. I drove past the apartment in Ridgemont this morning. Wanted to check on things. There's a car parked across the street. Black SUV, Nevada plates, two men inside. They've been sitting there since at least 5 a.m. I circled the block twice. They didn't move. Nevada plates. Hale's men. Already in Ridgemont. Already watching the apartment. Already knowing exactly where Elena and Avery were. How fast can you get there? Ronan said. I'm parked 2 blocks away. I never left. Of course he hadn't. Mac, the man who rebuilt engines because machines never lied to him, and who drank bourbon alone because people had hurt him in ways he couldn't articulate, had spent the night in a parking lot 2 blocks from a woman and child he'd known for less than 36 hours, watching their building in the dark, because that was what Mac did. He guarded things. He stood between soft things and hard things and absorbed the impact with his body because his body was the only currency he'd ever trusted. Don't approach them, Ronan said. Stay where you are. I'm calling Silas. We're moving Elena and Avery today. Now. Where? Ronan looked at Caleb. Caleb, who had driven 600 miles through the night with a folder full of dynamite, and the expression of a man who had already accepted that the next 72 hours would determine whether the Iron Ravens survived or tore themselves apart. The clubhouse, Ronan said. Bring them here. Ronan, if Hale's people are watching, then they'll see 11 Harleys pull into that parking lot, and they can decide whether they want to explain to their boss why they started a war on a residential street in front of a 9-year-old girl. Bring them here, Mac, now. He hung up, called Silas. The medic answered on the first ring. He'd been awake, of course. Men like Silas didn't sleep in sequences longer than 90 minutes. His body had never fully left the combat rotation. Elena and Avery are being moved to the clubhouse. I need you to call Dr. Patel. Tell her the surgery timeline just accelerated. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what protocols need to be bypassed. That woman is getting the operation this week. This week? Ronan, the financial hold on her account. I'll handle the hold. You handle the doctor. He hung up again, looked at Caleb. How much is left in the National Treasury? The real number, not the one Hale reports. Caleb's expression shifted. For the first time since he'd arrived, something resembling dark amusement crossed his face. That depends on whether you want the number Hale shows the council, or the number that actually exists. The real one. After 12 years of diversion, about 60% of what it should be. Maybe 700,000 when it should be north of 1.2 million. Can you freeze the accounts? Lock Hale out? I'm the chapter-level treasurer, Ronan. I don't have access to national accounts. Only Hale and his VP of Finance, a man named Doug Renner, who is either complicit or the most oblivious accountant in the western United States, can move national money. Then we go around them, expose the diversion, take it to every chapter president simultaneously, force an emergency council vote. Caleb studied him. The reading glasses on his forehead caught the fluorescent light. You're talking about a coup. I'm talking about accountability. In practice, it's the same thing. You bring this to the chapter presidents, you're accusing the national president of 12 years of financial fraud. Half of them owe Hale their charters. A third of them are personally loyal. You'll split the organization down the middle. It's already split. It's been split since Hale pushed Phantom out, and none of us knew it. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he gathered the papers, squared them against the table, and put them back in the folder. There's one more thing you need to know, he said. The letter G in the report. The initial on the file. The person who originally compiled the evidence against Hale. The person who tried to get Phantom to use it before Hale moved against him. Who? Garrick. Lyle Garrick, former National Sergeant at Arms. I know who Garrick is. He died 4 years ago. Heart attack. At least that's what the... Ronan stopped. The words curdled in his mouth. That's what the report said, Caleb finished. Heart attack. Found alone in his apartment in Reno. No autopsy requested, no investigation, case closed in 48 hours. The implication hung in the air between them like a blade suspended from a thread. You think Hale? I think Garrick knew what Phantom knew. I think he tried to do what Phantom tried to do. And I think the outcome was different because Garrick didn't have a family to leverage, couldn't be forced out with an ultimatum, had to be removed a different way. Ronan's hands were on the table. He was gripping the edge of it hard enough that the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. His knuckles were white. The raven tattoo on his left forearm seemed to pulse with the pressure of his grip, the bird's wings stretching, the ink blurred by sweat and age. How many? He said. How many what? How many brothers has Hale buried to keep this quiet? Caleb shook his head. I don't know. Phantom was exiled. Garrick is dead. There may be others. I haven't had time to look. Then we need the evidence Phantom kept, the copies. If Garrick sent him a drive or documents or anything, it's in that apartment, with the girl. Or with the girl herself, Caleb said quietly. Children notice things, Ronan, especially children who've learned to survive. Ronan's phone buzzed, a text from Mac. SUV is moving. 2 more vehicles just arrived, 3 total. They're not watching anymore. They're setting up. Setting up. The words meant something specific in the language of men who had spent decades in a world where surveillance turned into action without warning. Setting up meant positions, angles, exits covered. It meant the watching phase was over and the operational phase had begun. Ronan grabbed his jacket, grabbed his keys, looked at Caleb. You carry? Caleb's face went hard. I'm an accountant, Ronan. That's not what I asked. Caleb opened his jacket. A compact pistol sat in a leather shoulder holster beneath his left arm. He'd been wearing it the entire time. I drove 600 miles through the night with a folder that could put Victor Hale in prison. I'm not an idiot. They moved. Ronan's Harley fired in the cold morning air, that deep, chest-rattling thunder that announced itself 3 blocks in any direction. Caleb followed in the pickup. They rode south toward Ridgemont as the sky turned from gray to pale white, the sun invisible behind a ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the valley like a hand. Ronan called the chapter as he rode, one by one. Silas first, then Harlan, then Tommy, then every man who had voted yes at the table. Come now. Ridgemont. Avery's building. Full show. He didn't explain, didn't have time. The responses came back in single words. Rolling, 10 minutes, on my way. The vocabulary of men who understood that when Ronan Graves used that voice, questions could wait. He did not call Dex. Dex, who hadn't gone home, whose bike was missing, whose phone was dark. They reached Ridgemont in 22 minutes. Mac was parked in an alley 2 blocks east of the apartment building, his engine idling, his hands on the grips, his eyes locked on the street. Ronan pulled alongside him. The big man's face was rigid beneath the beard, his jaw set in a way that Ronan had only seen twice before. Once before a bar fight that had put 3 men in the hospital, and once at a funeral where Mac had carried the casket alone because no one else could lift it. 3 vehicles, Mac said. Black SUV, gray sedan, white pickup. All Nevada plates. I count 6 men total. 2 in the SUV, 2 in the sedan, 2 walking the perimeter on foot. They're not armed visibly, but they're carrying. You can see it in the jacket lines. Have they approached the building? Not yet, but one of the foot guys went to the building entrance 10 minutes ago, checked the mailboxes, wrote down the unit number, came back out. They knew the apartment, they knew the floor, they knew the unit. Behind them, engines. Silas arrived first, then Harlan and Tommy together, then Corbin, who still wouldn't meet Ronan's eyes but had come anyway because even a compromised conscience understood that a child was in danger. 7 riders total, 8 with Ronan. Not enough for a confrontation, enough for a wall. Ronan dismounted, removed his helmet. The cold morning air hit his face and sharpened everything. The outlines of the buildings, the sound of a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust. Silas, you're with me. We go in. We get Elena and Avery. We bring them out. Mac, you and Harlan take the front entrance. Nobody goes in after us. Tommy, Corbin, cover the parking lot. Engines running. We're not staying. And the 6 men? Silas asked. They'll see us. They'll count us. And they'll call Hale. That's fine. I want Hale to know we moved her. I want him to know where she is. Because the clubhouse is our ground, and if he wants what Phantom had, he's going to have to walk through our door to get it. They moved. Ronan and Silas entered the building through a side door that smelled like mildew and laundry detergent. The stairwell was narrow. Their boots echoed on the concrete steps. At the second floor, the hallway stretched ahead of them, dim, flickering overhead light, carpet that had once been beige and was now the color of exhaustion. Unit 2C. Ronan knocked. The same 3 knocks. Slow, heavy. The door opened on the chain. Avery's face appeared in the gap. She looked at Ronan, then past him at Silas, then down the hallway in both directions. 9 years old, and she checked the corridor like a combat veteran checking a perimeter. Something's wrong, she said. Not a question. We need to move. You and your mom. Now. Pack what matters. 2 minutes. Avery didn't argue, didn't ask where or why. She undid the chain, opened the door, and walked to her mother's recliner where Elena was dozing with the oxygen concentrator humming beside her. Mom, wake up. We have to go. Elena's eyes opened. The confusion lasted 1 second. Then she saw Ronan in the doorway, saw the expression on his face, and the confusion was replaced by the flat, efficient calm of a woman who had been living in crisis long enough that one more emergency was simply another item on a list that never ended. My oxygen, portable unit, Silas said. He was already moving to the concentrator, disconnecting the stationary machine, switching Elena to the portable tank that sat beside it. His hands moved with the speed and certainty of a man who had managed medical equipment under fire and considered a second-floor apartment in Ridgemont to be a relatively low-stress environment. Avery disappeared into her bedroom. When she came back 30 seconds later, she was carrying her school backpack. Inside it, Ronan could see the outline through the fabric, was the shoebox. She caught him looking at it. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not explanation, but recognition. The recognition of 2 people who both understood that the contents of that box were the center of gravity around which everything was now spinning. I have something, Avery said. Her voice was low, controlled. Something my dad left. I think it's what those men outside are looking for. Ronan crouched to her level. His knees ached, his back ached, everything ached. He was 61 years old, and he had not slept in 38 hours, and the weight of what he had learned in the past 12 hours was pressing on his spine like an anvil balanced on a column of vertebrae that were long past their warranty. What is it? She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the USB drive, small, black, unremarkable. The kind of object that could contain a shopping list or a photograph, or enough evidence to bring down an empire. Ronan took it, held it in his palm. It weighed almost nothing. Your dad left this? Someone sent it to him. There's a letter. It says everything's on the drive. Names, dates, accounts. Ronan closed his hand around it. The plastic warmed against his skin. Did you look at it? I don't have a computer. He put the drive in his vest pocket, buttoned the pocket closed, stood up. Let's go. They moved down the hallway. Silas supported Elena, one arm around her waist, the portable oxygen tank hanging from his shoulder. Avery walked ahead of them, backpack on, steps quick and precise. Ronan brought up the rear, his hand resting on the inside of his jacket, where the weight of Caleb's paranoia suddenly felt less like paranoia and more like prophecy. The stairwell, the side door, the parking lot. 8 motorcycles idled in a ragged semicircle. Max stood at the center like a monument. Harlan flanked the entrance. Tommy and Corbin held the perimeter. Caleb's pickup was pulled up to the building's exit, rear gate down, ready. Across the street, the 3 vehicles sat in a row. 6 men, 2 standing outside the SUV, 4 visible through windows. They watched. They counted. They did not move. Elena was helped into the truck. Avery climbed in beside her. Silas loaded the oxygen equipment. Caleb got behind the wheel. Ronan stood in the parking lot and looked across the street. One of the men by the SUV, tall, shaved head, a neck thick enough to suggest either dedicated fitness or dedicated violence, held a phone to his ear. Talking, reporting. Ronan waited until the man lowered the phone. Then he raised his hand. Not a wave, not a greeting. A gesture that said simply, I see you. I know what you are. And I'm still standing here. The man stared back. No expression, no response. Then the SUV started. The sedan started. The pickup started. 3 vehicles pulled away from the curb in a slow, synchronized departure that had the choreographed quality of a retreat executed under observation. Controlled, deliberate, designed to communicate that they were leaving by choice, not by force. They turned the corner and disappeared. Mac pulled alongside Ronan. That won't be the last time. No. Hale knows where the clubhouse is. He does. And he knows we have the girl. Ronan looked at the truck where Avery sat beside her mother, the backpack on her lap, the shoebox inside it, the USB drive now in Ronan's pocket. The evidence that Phantom had carried, that Garrick had compiled, that 2 men had been destroyed for possessing. Evidence that was now in the hands of a chapter president who had told his best friend to drop it 10 years ago, and had spent every minute since living inside the comfortable lie that Phantom's departure was a choice. It wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. And Ronan had been the judge who refused to hear the appeal. Let's go home, Ronan said. The convoy moved. 11 engines and 1 pickup truck heading north on roads that none of them were sure would lead anywhere safe. Behind them, Ridgemont receded, its strip malls and foreclosed houses and underfunded schools shrinking in the mirrors until they were just shapes on a horizon that didn't care whether anyone came back. Somewhere north of the Oregon border, Victor Hale received a phone call. He listened for 45 seconds, set the phone down, poured another bourbon. Then he opened his own laptop and typed a single message to 17 chapter presidents across 4 states. Emergency session, National Council, 48 hours. Agenda, charter revocation for Redfield. Chapter, removal of Ronan graves and recovery of stolen organizational property currently in possession of a minor. He sent it. Closed the laptop. Looked out the window at the compound yard where a dozen motorcycles gleamed in the morning light, their riders already gearing up, already moving, already pointed south. The Iron Ravens were about to go to war with themselves. And at the center of it, a 9-year-old girl with a backpack full of a dead man's secrets, riding in the cab of a pickup truck between a dying mother and a medic who hadn't slept in 2 days, surrounded by men on motorcycles who had just traded their safety for a promise made by a ghost. Ronan rode at the head of the column, the USB drive pressed against his chest through the leather of his vest. The wind cut across his face. The engine beneath him roared its familiar thunder. He had 48 hours before the National Council convened. 48 hours to expose a fraud that had been running for 12 years. 48 hours to save a chapter, protect a child, and undo the worst mistake of his life. And somewhere in those 48 hours, he would have to look at the contents of that drive and learn exactly how badly he had failed the man he called his brother. The road stretched ahead, cold, empty, unforgiving, just like the truth. The USB drive contained 47 files. Ronan sat at the clubhouse table with Caleb's laptop open in front of him, the screen casting pale blue light across his face in the early afternoon dark. The curtains were drawn. The overhead fluorescents were off. Max stood behind him, looking over his shoulder. Silas sat across the table, a notepad in front of him, writing in the small, precise handwriting of a man who had once documented combat injuries on index cards in the back of a transport helicopter. 47 files. Spreadsheets. Scanned documents. Photographs of handwritten ledger entries. A folder of screenshots showing wire transfers with routing numbers and timestamps. And one audio file, 13 minutes and 22 seconds long, labeled simply Hail _Devlin _call _2 Caleb had left 2 hours ago to intercept the National Council summons at the Reno chapter, where 3 presidents he still trusted were preparing to receive Hale's emergency session order. He'd taken copies of everything on the drive, physical copies printed in the clubhouse's ancient inkjet printer that jammed twice and produced documents with streaked toner, but readable. He'd also uploaded the files to 3 separate cloud accounts under names that had nothing to do with motorcycles or ravens or anything that could be traced back to the club. If something happens to me, he'd said, standing at the truck with the engine running, the files go public. All of them. Every chapter president, every law enforcement contact I have, every journalist who's ever written about motorcycle organizations. Hale won't be able to contain it. Nothing's going to happen to you, Ronan had said. Caleb had looked at him with an expression that was equal parts pity and affection. You've been saying things like that your whole life, Ronan, and you've been wrong more often than you'll ever admit. Then he'd driven north, and Ronan had gone inside and opened the files, and for the next 2 hours the world had rearranged itself into something uglier than he'd imagined. The fraud was meticulous. 12 years of skimming, documented in Garrick's handwriting, and Phantom's organized spreadsheets. The shell companies, there were 7 of them, not 3 as Caleb had initially thought, had purchased property across Nevada, Idaho, and Northern California. Commercial lots, apartment complexes, a strip mall in Sparks, a warehouse in Boise. Total estimated value, $2.3 million, all of it built on dues paid by men who welded pipe and poured concrete and drove trucks and bled for the Brotherhood because they believed it was theirs. But it wasn't the money that made Ronan's hands shake. It was the audio file. He played it once, then again, then a third time, while Mac gripped the back of the chair hard enough to crack the wood, and Silas stopped writing and sat perfectly still with his pen suspended above the paper. Victor Hale's voice, recorded in 2015, speaking to Marcus Devlin on what appeared to be a personal phone line. The audio was grainy, recorded covertly, probably on a second device placed nearby. Garrick's work, most likely. The conversation was casual, relaxed, 2 men discussing business over what sounded like drinks. Devlin: what about the cross problem? Hale: handled. Devlin: he's out? Hale: gone. Walked away clean. At least that's the story. Devlin: and if he talks? Hale: he won't. I made sure of that. His woman's got a kid now. People with kids don't talk. They calculate. And the math never works out in their favor. Devlin: and the sergeant at arms? Garrick? A pause. The sound of ice in a glass. Hale. Garrick's a different problem. He doesn't have family to leverage. He's a lifer, true believer. That makes him dangerous. Devlin. So what do you do with a true believer? Another pause. Longer. Hale. You wait. And when the time is right, you solve the problem permanently. The recording ended. Ronan sat in the silence that followed. The laptop screen glowed. The cursor blinked on the audio player's timeline. 13:22. 13 minutes of a man's voice discussing the systematic destruction of people who trusted him, delivered with the tone of someone reviewing inventory. He threatened Avery, Ronan said. His voice was quiet, not calm, compressed, the voice of a man containing something that, if released, would not stop. Before she was even born, he used the idea of her, the existence of a child, as a weapon to keep phantoms silent. And Garrick, Silas said, that line about solving the problem permanently. Garrick died of a heart attack. Garrick died alone in an apartment in Reno with no autopsy and a case closed in 2 days. The three men looked at each other across the table. The distance between suspicion and certainty had collapsed. What remained was the simple, terrible arithmetic of what they were now committed to, exposing a man who had demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his empire. Not a criminal on the margins, not an outsider. The president of their own organization, a man who wore the same patch, spoke the same oaths, sat at the same table. Family. The word tasted different now, like rust, like blood drawn from biting your own tongue. Max spoke first. What's the play? The National Council meets in 36 hours. Caleb's going to Reno to get ahead of it. He'll present the evidence to the presidents he trusts, Jackson in Sacramento, Whitmore in Boise, Del Rosa in Portland. If he can get 3 votes, we can force a formal audit. A real one. Not Hale's internal theater. An external review with access to every account. And if he can't get 3 votes, then we go public. Law enforcement, federal level. We turn over everything on this drive to people who can subpoena bank records and depose witnesses and do the things we can't do from inside a motorcycle club. The silence that followed was heavy with what Ronan was proposing. Going to law enforcement was the nuclear option, not because the men at this table feared prosecution, but because it would shatter the organizational structure that every Iron Ravens chapter depended on. The club would survive as a name, maybe, as patches on leather, as tattoos on aging skin, but as a functioning brotherhood, a network of men who trusted each other with their lives, their families, their worst moments. It would be finished. The radiation from that kind of exposure didn't discriminate between the guilty and the innocent. There's another problem, Silas said. He set his pen down. Elena's surgery. What about it? Doctor, Patel called back while you were on the road. She can operate. She's willing. But the hospital's board requires pre-authorization for unfunded procedures, even charity cases. The financial hold on Elena's account means the surgery can't be scheduled without either clearing the debt or getting an institutional override from the hospital's chief administrator. He paused. Who, as it turns out, sits on the board of Devlin Partners Development Group. The connection landed like a hammer on glass. The hospital administrator is connected to Devlin? His name is Arthur Kessler. He's been on Devlin's board for 6 years. According to public filings, which I pulled during the drive up here, he holds equity in 3 of the 7 shell companies that Hale and Devlin operate. So the man who controls whether Elena gets surgery is financially entangled with the man who's been laundering club money. Yes. Ronan pressed his palms flat on the table. The wood was cold. The scars in its surface, burns, cuts, ring stains, pressed into his skin like a topographic map of every decision this table had witnessed. Hale isn't just coming for the drive. He's got Elena boxed in. The surgery, the money, the hospital. It's all connected. If we push him, he tightens the noose on her. If we back off, she dies waiting for a procedure that a man on his payroll will never authorize. Then we don't push and we don't back off, Max said. We go through. At the back of the clubhouse, in the small room that had been hastily converted from a storage closet into something approaching livable, a cot, a lamp, a space heater that rattled like it was arguing with itself. Avery sat on the floor with her back against the wall. Elena was asleep on the cot, the portable oxygen unit hissing beside her, her face slack and gray in the yellow light. The room smelled like old cardboard and motor oil and the faintly sweet, faintly chemical scent of the supplemental oxygen. Avery could hear voices through the wall. Not the words, just the rhythm. The low frequency of men making decisions. The cadence of controlled urgency. She'd heard it before in her mother's hospital rooms, when doctors stepped into hallways and spoke in voices they thought couldn't penetrate doors. She'd learned that the information people tried to hide behind walls and closed doors was always the information that mattered most. She looked at her backpack. The shoebox was inside it. The letters were inside the shoebox. She'd given Ronan the USB drive, and something about surrendering it had felt both terrifying and correct, like handing off a weight she'd been carrying without knowing its name. But the letters remained. A dozen of them, written in coded language by men with road names. She couldn't read most of them, but she had read one. Found it last night while the clubhouse was quiet, while her mother slept and the bikers talked in the main room. A letter from someone called Wraith, addressed to her father, dated 8 years ago. Short, 3 paragraphs. Written in a hand that pressed hard enough to emboss the paper. David, I know what Hale did to you. I know why you left. I want you to know that not everyone believed the story. Some of us knew. Some of us said nothing because we were afraid, and that makes us just as guilty. I'm writing this because silence is a poison, and I've been swallowing it for too long. If you ever come back, if you ever decide to fight, I will stand with you. Not because it's safe, because it's right. Wraith. Avery didn't know who Wraith was, but the letter had been sealed, and her father had opened it and read it and kept it in a shoebox in a closet in an apartment in Ridgemont, which meant it had mattered to him, which meant it might matter now. She heard boots in the hallway, heavy, deliberate. A knock on the door, gentle this time, not the commanding knock Ronan used. She opened it. Max stood there, filling the doorframe like a wall with a pulse. He held 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper towels and a juice box. Turkey or ham? Turkey. He handed it to her. Stood there for a moment looking past her at Elena sleeping on the cot. His expression, buried beneath the beard, beneath the scarring, beneath the accumulated damage of a life lived at high velocity, contained something that Avery recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror. Not pity, not sadness, helplessness. The look of someone who wanted to fix something and was discovering that some things could not be fixed with hands, no matter how large or capable those hands were. Is she going to be okay? Avery asked. Mac looked at her. We're going to make sure she is. That's not what I asked. The directness stopped him. He crouched down, a slow, controlled descent, knees popping, and met her eyes at her level. I don't know, kid. The truth is I don't know. But I know that every man out there is going to do everything he can. And I know your dad trusted us enough to write that note. And I know you trusted us enough to come find us. So we're going to earn that trust, or we're going to die trying. That's all I've got. Avery looked at him for a long time. Then she took a bite of the sandwich and chewed it slowly. And the act of a child eating a turkey sandwich while a man twice her height crouched in a doorway trying not to cry was perhaps the most precisely human moment the clubhouse had ever contained. Night fell. The clubhouse settled into the tense quiet of a structure preparing for siege. Mac welded a steel plate across the inside of the front door, not because it would stop determined entry, but because the act of reinforcement was its own form of prayer for men who didn't pray. Tommy and Harlan took watch positions in the yard, sitting on overturned crates, smoking in the dark, their eyes adjusting to the blackness until they could see the fence line and the road beyond it. Silas inventoried the medical supplies. Not much, but enough for field dressing and basic trauma response, skills his body remembered even when his mind tried to forget. Ronan sat at the table with his phone, working through the list of chapter presidents, calling each one. Not selling, not pleading, informing. His voice was level and factual, the way Caleb had been when he'd presented the evidence. He told them what the drive contained, told them about the shell companies, the diverted funds, the audio recording, told them about Phantom and Garrick, told them about the girl, Some listened, some argued, some hung up. Jackson in Sacramento. I've had doubts about Hale for years, never had proof. Send me everything. While Whitmore in Boise. You're asking me to go against a sitting national president on the word of a dead man and a 9-year-old girl. You understand how that sounds. Del Rosa in Portland. I'm in, but you need to know, Hale called me an hour ago. He's framing this as a rogue chapter stealing from the Treasury. He's got at least 8 presidents lined up to vote for your revocation. 8 against, 3 in favor, 4 undecided, 2 unreachable. The math was clear. Even with the evidence, even with the recording, the council vote would go against them. Hale had spent 12 years building loyalty, not through trust, but through dependency. Chapters that relied on national funding, presidents who owed their positions to Hale's endorsement, men whose charters could be revoked with a phone call. The Iron Raven's national structure was not a democracy. It was a patronage system disguised as one, and Hale held every lever. The vote's going to fail, Ronan told Mac at midnight. They stood in the yard, breath clouding, the stars hidden behind clouds. Even with the evidence, he's got the numbers. Then we skip the vote. And do what? Go federal, like you said. Hand everything to the FBI. Let them dismantle it. That destroys the club, Mac. Every chapter, every brother, not just Hale. The club's already destroyed. We just haven't admitted it yet. Ronan's phone rang. Caleb. The call was short, less than 2 minutes. When Ronan hung up, his face had changed. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His mouth was set in a line that was no longer determination. It was something past determination, something that had accepted cost and was now simply moving forward because stopping was no longer a direction available on the compass. Caleb met with Jackson and Del Rosa. They've agreed to call an emergency injunction, a procedural challenge to Hale's council session. It won't stop the vote, but it'll delay it. 72 hours. That's something. It's not enough. Hale's riders left Oregon 4 hours ago. 22 men. They'll be here by morning. 22 against 8. On open ground, in a clubhouse with welded doors and a chain-link fence and a parking lot that offered no tactical advantage whatsoever. We're not fighting 22 men, Ronan. No, we're not. He pulled out his phone again, dialed a number he'd been carrying in his head for 3 days. The number Caleb had given him, written on a napkin in handwriting that trembled. A number in Reno. A federal number. It rang twice. Special Agent Torres? My name is Ronan Graves. I'm the president of the Redfield chapter of the Iron Ravens Motorcycle Club. I have evidence of financial fraud, money laundering, and possible homicide committed by our national president, Victor Hale. I need to speak with someone tonight. A pause. The sound of a chair creaking. Then a voice, female, sharp, immediately alert. Mr. Graves, I've been waiting for this call for about 3 years. Where are you? Ronan gave her the address, gave her the outline. Told her about the drive, the shell companies, the audio recording, Garrick's death, Phantom's exile. Told her about Elena and Avery. Told her about the 22 riders heading south. Torres was quiet for a long time. Then, I can have a team in Redfield by 6 a.m., but I need the original drive. I need the original documents, and I need you to understand that once you hand those over, this stops being your fight and becomes mine. You won't control the outcome. You won't control who gets investigated, and you won't control who gets hurt. I understand. Do your men understand? Ronan looked through the clubhouse window. Mac at the table cleaning grease from beneath his fingernails with a pocket knife. Silas reading his coverless book by lamplight. Tommy and Harlan in the yard, smoking, their cigarette tips glowing like small orange stars in the darkness. Corbin asleep in a chair with his arms crossed, his face troubled even in unconsciousness. They'll understand, Ronan said. 6 a.m., Mr. Graves. Don't go anywhere. He hung up. Stood in the cold yard with the phone in his hand and the enormity of what he'd just done pressing on his chest like a plate of steel. He had called the law. He, Ronan Graves, chapter president, patch holder for 31 years, a man who had built his entire identity on the principle that the Brotherhood handled its own business, had picked up a phone and invited the federal government into his clubhouse. Phantom would have understood. Phantom, who had tried to fix it from the inside and been destroyed for it. Phantom, who had written a note to his daughter saying, "Find them," because he believed, even after everything, that the Brotherhood would do the right thing when it mattered most. This was the right thing. It didn't feel like the right thing. It felt like amputation, like cutting off a limb to save the body. Necessary, irreversible, and agonizing. He went inside, told them, said it plain, no preamble, no justification. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, each one sending ripples that expanded outward, touching every man differently. Mac nodded. Once. That was all. Silas closed his book. About time. Tommy rubbed his face, looked at the ceiling, looked at the floor, then. My old man was a raven. 30 years. He'd roll in his grave. A pause. But he'd also understand. Corbin woke up. Heard the news, stood, walked to the door, stopped. I should have told you, he said, his back to the room. Told me what? Dex called me after the vote, said Hale wanted to know what happened at the table. I told him. He turned around. His eyes were red. His jaw was shaking. I told him everything, Ronan. The vote, the fun, the girl, all of it. I called Hale's office and I reported like a recruit because I was scared. I was scared of losing my charter and my patch, and the only thing in my life that means anything. His voice broke. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix it. The room held its breath. Ronan looked at Corbin, a man he'd known for 9 years, ridden with for 9 years, trusted for 9 years. A man who had betrayed him not from malice, but from the most human of failures, fear. Did you tell them about the USB drive? No, I didn't know about it then. I called Hale the night of the vote, before Caleb came, before any of this. And Dex? Dex has been Hale's ear in this chapter for at least 2 years, maybe longer. He reports to Hale's sergeant-at-arms in Nevada. I didn't know that until Dex contacted me after the vote. He told me it was just keeping National informed. Standard. I wanted to believe him. Where's Dex now? I don't know. He stopped answering my calls yesterday. Ronan processed this, filed it. The anger was there. Enormous, pressurized, a contained detonation waiting for permission. But he pressed it down because anger was a luxury that consumed time, and time was the one resource they no longer had. You stay, Ronan said. You stay and you face what comes. That's how you fix it. Corbin's chin dropped to his chest. He nodded, sat back down, did not speak again. 3 a.m. The clubhouse was silent except for the hiss of Elena's oxygen and the occasional creak of the building adjusting to the cold. Ronan sat at the table with Phantom's Polaroid in front of him. 2 men laughing. The crease down the center was deeper now. He'd been handling it too much, the paper softening, the image degrading with every touch. He heard footsteps. Small ones. Avery appeared in the hallway, barefoot, pajama pants too long for her legs, dragging on the concrete floor. Can't sleep, she said. Me either. She sat across from him, looked at the photograph. Were you and my dad really that close? Closer than I deserved. What does that mean? Ronan was quiet for a moment. The truth pressed against the inside of his teeth. The truth about the conversation in the diner, the night Phantom had come to him with concerns about the treasury, the night Ronan had told him to drop it and sent him back into the dark alone. It means I let him down when it mattered most. He came to me for help, and I didn't listen. Avery studied his face, not with a child's curiosity, with a diagnostician's precision. Reading the lines, the tension, the weight. Is that why you're doing all this? Because you feel guilty? The question was so direct, so surgically precise, that it cut through every defense Ronan had spent 61 years constructing. Partly, he said. Yeah, partly. What's the other part? He looked at her. Phantom's eyes. Phantom's jaw. The same refusal to accept the world as presented. The other part is that your father was the best man I ever knew. And the best thing he ever did was you. And I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt the best thing the best man ever did. Avery reached across the table. Her hand, small, cold, the nails bitten short, rested on top of the Polaroid, on top of her father's image, on top of Ronan's. Then don't. 5:45 a.m. Dawn approaching, the sky shifting from black to charcoal. The yard visible now in shades of gray. Motorcycles, oil drums, the welded door, the fence. Mac's voice from the window. Headlights! Everyone moved. Ronan to the window, Silas to Elena's room. Tommy and Harlan from the yard to the building. Corbin to the back door, his body positioned between the exit and the storage room where Avery crouched beside her sleeping mother. Headlights. Not two, not four. A line of them, stretching back along the road like a luminous spine. Single headlights. Motorcycles. And behind them, the wider beams of cars and trucks. They came slowly, deliberately. The sound reached the clubhouse before the light did. That unmistakable, ground-level thunder of massed Harley engines, the collective heartbeat of 24 machines moving in formation. It built in layers, each engine adding its frequency to the chord until the air itself vibrated and the windows in the clubhouse rattled in their frames. They stopped at the fence, engines idling, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn murk. Ronan counted 22 motorcycles, 3 trucks, 2 SUVs, close to 30 men. A single figure dismounted from the lead bike and walked to the gate. Tall, silver hair cut close. A leather vest over a black thermal, the patches immaculate. National President flash, Iron Raven's center patch, a row of service pins that glinted in the headlights. Victor Hale. He stood at the gate with his hands at his sides and looked at the clubhouse. Then he raised his voice, not shouting, not threatening, conversational. The volume of a man who knew the silence around him was complete enough that normal speech would carry. Ronan, come outside. Let's end this like brothers. Inside, Mac was already shaking his head. Don't. I have to. It's a setup. Probably. But Torres is 15 minutes out. I need 15 minutes. Ronan walked to the welded door, paused, turned to Mac. If something happens to me, the drive goes to Torres. Elena gets the surgery. Avery gets out. Mac's jaw flexed beneath the beard. His eyes glistened. He nodded once, the way he always did. A single, weighted movement that contained more than most men could say in a paragraph. Ronan unbolted the door, pushed the steel plate aside, stepped into the yard. The cold hit him like a wall. His breath clouded. His boots crunched on frost-covered concrete. He walked to the gate, 30 feet that felt like 30 miles, and stopped on his side of the chain link. Victor Hale stood 3 feet away, separated by wire and rust and 30 years of shared history that had been alive for at least 12 of them. Up close, Hale looked exactly like what he was, a man of power and patience, groomed and controlled, his face revealing nothing. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, the eyes of a man who had learned to remove himself from his own expressions the way a surgeon removes himself from the blood. You look tired, Ronan. I am tired. Then let's make this simple. Give me the drive. Give me whatever copies Caleb made. Stand down at the council vote, and this ends. No sanctions, no revocations, no harm to the girl or her mother. You have my word. Your word. Ronan tasted the phrase. It had the flavor of ash. Like the word you gave Phantom? When you told the council he was an informant? When you threatened his unborn child to keep him quiet? Hale's expression didn't change. Not a flicker. Not a twitch. The absence of reaction was itself a confession. An innocent man would have shown surprise, anger, confusion. Hale showed nothing because nothing Ronan said was news to him. David Cross made choices, Hale said. So did Garrick. So did everyone who stuck their nose into business that wasn't theirs. The organization isn't a democracy, Ronan. It never was. It's a machine, and machines require maintenance. Sometimes that means replacing parts that don't function properly. Parts. That's what Phantom was to you. A part. That's what everyone is, including you. Behind Hale, 30 men sat on idling motorcycles, their faces lit by instrument panels and the first thin light of dawn. Some of them Ronan recognized, men from Nevada and Oregon, men he'd sat with at national gatherings, shared meals with, ridden beside on charity runs and memorial rides. Brothers. Or what he'd believed were brothers. Now they were an army, and the man commanding them had just called a dead father a replaceable component. You're not getting the drive, Victor. Then I'm going to take it. From a clubhouse full of armed men with a federal agent 10 minutes away? Hale's eyes narrowed, the first crack in the mask. Small, brief, but visible. You called the feds. I did. You know what that makes you. It makes me the man who should have listened to Phantom 10 years ago. It makes me the man who should have asked questions instead of swallowing every lie you fed us. It makes me a lot of things I'm not proud of, Victor, but it doesn't make me you. Hale stared at him. The engines idled. The dawn crept forward. Somewhere in the distance, the first sound, faint but distinct. Not motorcycles. Cars. Multiple vehicles, moving fast. The high RPM whine of government sedans driven by people who did not observe speed limits. Hale heard it too. His head turned slightly, his jaw tightened. You've destroyed the club, he said. No, you destroyed it 12 years ago. I'm just turning the lights on. The sound grew louder, closer. Hale looked back at Ronan. For one moment, half a second, maybe less, something moved behind those pale eyes. Not fear, not rage, something older. Something that might have been in a different man, in a different life. Regret. Then it was gone. Hale turned and walked back to his motorcycle, mounted it. The engine roared. He raised his hand, a signal, and the column began to move. Not forward, backward. A retreat executed with the same controlled precision as the advance. The motorcycles peeling away in pairs, the trucks following, the headlights receding down the road like a tide pulling back from a shore. But Ronan didn't watch them leave. He was looking at the yard, at the clubhouse door where Max stood with his hands braced on the frame, at the window where Silas was visible in silhouette, at the small shape behind Silas, Avery standing on her toes, watching through the glass, her face pressed against the cold pane, her breath fogging a circle that expanded and contracted with each exhale. And beyond the fence, coming up the road from the south, a convoy of black sedans with federal plates, their headlights cutting through the dawn like scalpels. Special Agent Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle before it had fully stopped. Short, compact, a dark suit beneath a tactical vest, her badge visible on a lanyard. She walked to the gate, looked at Ronan, looked at the retreating column of motorcycles disappearing over the ridge. Was that Hale? Yeah. He ran. He retreated. There's a difference. Not for long, there isn't. She looked at the clubhouse. I need the drive. I need the documents. I need access to everyone inside. And I need to talk to the girl. Ronan looked at her. The sun was breaking the horizon now, a thin line of gold cutting beneath the cloud ceiling, painting the yard in copper and shadow. The frost on the concrete was beginning to melt. The motorcycles in the yard gleamed. The girl's name is Avery, he said. She's 9 years old. She rode a bus 40 miles to find us because her dead father told her to. You can talk to her, but you talk to her with me in the room, and you talk to her like she's a person, not a witness. Torres studied him, then nodded. Fair enough. They walked toward the clubhouse. Behind them, the last of Hale's motorcycles crested the ridge and vanished. The sound of their engines faded, that rolling thunder diminishing into the distance like a storm moving away, leaving behind the particular silence that follows departure. Not peace, not resolution, just the empty space where conflict had been, waiting to be filled with whatever came next. Inside the clubhouse, Elena was awake, sitting up on the cot, oxygen tubing in place, Avery beside her on the edge of the mattress, holding her mother's hand. The girl looked up when Ronan entered. Is it over? Ronan looked at her, at Elena, at the federal agents filing through the door behind him, at the USB drive in his pocket, the Polaroid on the table, the welded door, the scarred wood, the empty chairs where brothers had sat and argued and voted and betrayed and stayed. Not yet, he said. But the hard part is... Avery squeezed her mother's hand. Elena's eyes, dark, exhausted, still fighting, met Ronan's across the room. Outside, the sun continued to rise, the frost melted. The engines in the yard cooled and ticked in the warming air, counting down to something that hadn't arrived yet but was coming, rolling forward with the inevitability of distance closing, of promises kept, of the long road between what was broken and what might still, with enough time and enough stubbornness and enough love, be repaired. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Special Agent Torres and her team spent 11 hours inside the Redfield clubhouse on that first day, cataloging the contents of the USB drive, photographing documents, recording statements from every man present. She was methodical, precise, and utterly without sentiment. A woman who had spent 3 years building a case against financial corruption in motorcycle organizations, and who understood that the difference between justice and failure was documentation. Every file on the drive was copied, verified, chain of custody tagged, and sealed in evidence bags that Torres carried personally to the federal field office in Sacramento that evening. Within 72 hours, a federal judge in Nevada issued warrants for Victor Hale, Marcus Devlin, Doug Renner, and Arthur Kessler, the hospital administrator whose signature had blocked Elena's surgery while his bank accounts fattened on laundered club money. The warrants were served simultaneously at 4 a.m. on a Thursday. Hale was arrested at the Oregon compound, still in bed, his silver hair pressed flat against the pillow. The photographs that leaked to the press showed a man who looked smaller than his reputation. Diminished, ordinary, stripped of the leather and the authority and the silence that had made him formidable. In handcuffs and a gray t-shirt, Victor Hale looked like what he was, a 64-year-old man who had stolen from the people who trusted him and destroyed anyone who noticed. Devlin was taken at his office in Reno, Renner at his home in Boise, Kessler at the hospital where Elena Cross had been denied care, an irony that Torres later admitted she had choreographed deliberately, timing the arrest to occur in the lobby during a shift change so that the maximum number of medical staff would witness their administrator being escorted out in federal custody. The trials would take months. The forensic accounting would take longer. But the immediate effect was seismic. Within a week of the arrest, the Iron Ravens National Council dissolved itself, replaced by an interim board of chapter presidents led by Jackson from Sacramento and Del Rosa from Portland. The shell companies were frozen. The diverted funds, or what remained of them, approximately $1.4 million in real estate equity and liquid assets, were placed in receivership pending court orders for restitution. Dex surfaced 3 days after the arrests. He turned up at the Redfield clubhouse on foot, having left his motorcycle at a motel in Nevada where he'd been hiding since the night he'd reported the chapter vote to Hale's sergeant-at-arms. He stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, his cut still on his back, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has run out of places to run. Ronan met him outside. They stood 10 feet apart. The yard was wet from overnight rain. The sky was low and gray. Neither man moved to close the distance. "I didn't know about the money," Dex said. "Or Phantom, or Garrick. I need you to know that. Hale told me it was chapter oversight, standard reporting. He said every chapter had a liaison, and I was just—" "You were his informant, Dex." The word landed. Dex flinched, not from anger, from recognition. The same word that Hale had used to destroy Phantom now applied to the man who had unknowingly served Hale's purpose by doing exactly what Phantom had been falsely accused of. "I didn't know," Dex repeated. "I believe you." Dex looked up. Surprise broke through the guilt. "You do?" "Yeah. Because if you'd known, if you'd understood what Hale really was, you would have come to me. You're a lot of things, Dex. Stubborn, loud, wrong about carburetors approximately 90% of the time. But you're not capable of what Hale did. You don't have it in you. And I mean that as the highest compliment I've ever given you." Dex's face crumpled. He pressed his hand over his eyes and stood in the wet yard and shook, and Ronan let him, because some things needed to be expelled from the body before a man could start carrying anything new. When it passed, Dex wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at Ronan. "Can I come back?" "You never left. You just got lost for a while. We all did." The surgery happened on a Tuesday. Dr. Patel had called Silas the morning after Kessler's arrest to inform him that the financial hold on Elena's account had been lifted. Not reduced, not renegotiated, lifted entirely. The hospital's interim administrator, a woman named Dr. Catherine Lowe, who had spent 20 years in academic medicine and had no patience for corruption or the men who practiced it, had personally reviewed Elena's file and authorized the procedure under the hospital's charity care program. The $187,000 in accumulated medical debt was flagged for review by the federal restitution process, meaning that if the court determined Kessler's obstruction had contributed to the delay in care, the debt could be partially or fully discharged as part of the sentencing. None of this mattered to Avery. What mattered to Avery was that her mother was going into surgery, and that the outcome was not guaranteed, and that the 6 hours between the moment Elena was wheeled through the double doors and the moment the surgeon would emerge to deliver a verdict were going to be the longest 6 hours of her life. The waiting room at St. Catherine's Medical Center was on the 3rd floor. A carpeted rectangle with blue vinyl chairs and a television mounted in the corner playing a news channel with the volume off. There was a coffee machine that produced a liquid bearing only a theoretical relationship to actual coffee. There were magazines from the previous year. There were windows that looked out onto a parking structure. And there were bikers. They filled the room. Not loudly, not aggressively. They simply arrived, one by one, over the course of the first hour, until every chair was occupied and several men were standing along the walls. Max sat in the corner, his massive frame folded into a chair designed for someone half his size, his hands clasped between his knees. Silas sat beside Avery, his paperback in his vest pocket but untouched. He hadn't read a word all morning. Harlan and Tommy stood by the window, silent, watching nothing. Corbin sat near the door, still carrying the weight of his confession but present, accounted for, refusing to absent himself from the consequences of his actions or the community of his brothers. Dex arrived last. He walked in, looked around the room, found the only remaining space, a stretch of wall between the coffee machine and the fire extinguisher, and leaned against it with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He didn't speak to anyone. No one spoke to him. But no one asked him to leave, and that was enough. Ronan sat beside Elena's empty wheelchair, which Avery had refused to let the nurses take away. She sat in it instead, her feet dangling above the footrests, her hands gripping the armrests, her body occupying the space her mother had occupied as if holding the position would hold the woman in it. The hours passed. Mac got up twice to refill coffee cups. He moved through the room with the same strange delicacy he'd shown in Elena's kitchen. A man whose hands could crush steel performing acts of service so gentle they made the air feel different. He brought Avery a hot chocolate from the cafeteria downstairs. She held it with both hands and drank it slowly, and the heat traveled from her palms into her arms, into her chest, and for a few minutes the world was small enough to fit inside a paper cup. Silas sat with his elbows on his knees and his head down. He was not reading. He was not writing. He was doing the thing he had learned to do in hospital corridors halfway around the world, holding space. Existing in the gap between hope and outcome without trying to fill it with words or action. Simply being present in the uncertainty, which was the hardest and most important thing a human being could do for another human being in crisis. At the 4-hour mark, Avery spoke for the first time. What if she doesn't make it? The question went into the room like a stone into water. Every man heard it. Every man felt the ripple. Mac's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Harlan turned from the window. Corbin closed his eyes. Ronan leaned forward in his chair until he was close enough to Avery that his voice was for her alone. Then you'll have us. That's not what you want to hear. I know that. Nothing I say is going to make this part easier, and I'm not going to try. But I need you to hear me. Whatever happens through those doors, you are not alone. Not today, not tomorrow, not any day after that. Avery looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She had cried herself past crying somewhere in the 3rd hour, her body simply running out of the chemical components necessary for tears. And what remained was a strange, clear-eyed alertness that made her look simultaneously very old and very young. Promise? Promise. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the hot chocolate cup, which had gone empty. His hand closed around hers, scarred knuckles, swollen joints, the raven tattoo visible on his forearm. A man's hand that had done damage and delivered kindness in roughly equal measure over 61 years, now holding the hand of a child who was asking for the only thing that mattered. Someone to stay. Hour 5. The television on the wall played silently. Politicians talking, weather maps rotating, The world continuing its business with the profound indifference of systems that did not know or care that a woman was on a table in a room beyond the double doors with her chest open and a team of surgeons rebuilding the architecture of her breathing. Max stood up, sat down, stood up again, walked to the window, walked back. His body couldn't contain whatever was happening inside it, a restlessness that had nothing to do with impatience and everything to do with the particular helplessness of a man whose primary skill was fixing things with his hands, confronted by a situation that hands could not fix. He ended up standing next to Silas. "I hate this," he said quietly. "I know. Well, I can rebuild a transmission in 4 hours. I can weld a cracked frame. I can tear an engine down to individual components and put it back together blind. But I can't do anything here. I can't do a single thing." Silas looked up at him. The medic's eyes, those recalibrated, overexposed eyes that had seen too much and adjusted by seeing everything at a slight remove, held Mac's gaze with a steadiness that was its own form of anchor. "You bought her groceries, Mac. You filled her refrigerator. You carried her oxygen tank and made her daughter eat a banana and welded a steel plate to a door to keep her safe. You've been sleeping in a parking lot 2 blocks from her apartment because you couldn't stand the idea of her being unguarded. That's not nothing. That's everything." Mac's throat worked. He looked away, looked at the ceiling, looked at his hands, those enormous oil-stained, capable hands that were shaking slightly, the tremor visible in the fingers, a vibration that had nothing to do with age or weakness and everything to do with caring about something so much that your body couldn't hold it still. Hour 6. The double doors opened. Every head turned. Every body tensed. The room went silent with a totality that erased even the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant beep of monitoring equipment. Dr. Patel walked through the doors. She was still in surgical scrubs. Her mask was pulled down around her neck. Her face was tired, the specific tiredness of someone who had spent 6 hours performing work that required perfection and for whom perfection was not a standard but a necessity, because the margin between success and failure was measured in millimeters of tissue and seconds of response time. She looked at the room full of leather and scars and silence. She looked at Avery in the wheelchair. She looked at Ronan. The surgery was successful. The sound that followed was not cheering. It was not applause. It was something more fundamental. A collective exhalation, a release of held breath from a dozen sets of lungs simultaneously. A sound that was physiological before it was emotional. The room breathed. Every man in it breathed. Avery breathed. And then the crying started. Mac went first. The giant who had rebuilt engines and slept in parking lots and carried oxygen tanks and bought bananas put his hand over his face and wept with a violence that shook his shoulders and produced sounds that came from somewhere below his chest, below his stomach, from some reservoir of compressed grief and relief that had been accumulating pressure for days and now found an exit. Tommy cried. Harlan cried. Corbin pressed his forehead against the wall and his body convulsed once, twice, 3 times. Silas did not cry. He stood, walked to Avery, crouched beside the wheelchair, and put his hand on her shoulder. She turned and pressed her face against his chest, against the faded field jacket, against the cut over it, against the paperback book in the vest pocket that pressed into her cheek, and sobbed. Great, racking, total sobs that emptied her the way a storm empties a sky, leaving behind something clear and raw and new. Ronan sat in his chair with his hands on his knees and let the tears track down his face without wiping them. They followed the lines carved by 61 years of living, the roots and decisions and scars and sun damage, and dropped onto the backs of his hands, onto the raven tattoo, onto the skin that had been marked decades ago with the symbol of a brotherhood that he had nearly lost and was only now beginning to understand. Dr. Patel waited. She had seen this before, not with bikers specifically, but with families, with people who loved someone enough that the surgical outcome became a verdict on their own survival. She waited until the room had spent itself, until the breathing normalized, until Avery lifted her face from Silas's chest and looked at her with red eyes and wet cheeks and an expression of fragile, devastating hope. "She's going to need recovery time," Dr. Patel said. "Weeks of rest, months of rehabilitation, breathing therapy, follow-up procedures. It's a long road. We're good at roads, Max said, his voice wrecked, his face a mess. And the laugh that went through the room was the first real laughter any of them had produced in a week. The weeks after the surgery unfolded with a rhythm that the clubhouse had never known. Elena recovered in the converted storage room that had become, through accumulation of small improvements, an actual bedroom. Mac installed a proper door. Harlan painted the walls a pale blue that Elena had mentioned once, offhandedly, not as a request, just a memory of a color she'd liked in a house she'd lived in as a child, and that Harlan had filed away and acted on without discussion. Silas managed her medication schedule with the same clinical precision he applied to everything, typing it into a spreadsheet on his phone and setting alarms that went off with the regularity of a military operation. Avery went back to school. Not in Ridgemont, in Redfield, enrolled at the elementary school 3 blocks from the clubhouse, where Ronan had walked in one morning and spoken to the principal and produced documentation that Silas had somehow obtained from the Ridgemont School District within 48 hours of the surgery. The principal, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who had been running the school for 22 years and who had learned to read people the way farmers read weather, had looked at Ronan for a long time. "You're not her father," Mrs. Alvarez said. "No." "You're not a relative?" "No." "What are you?" Ronan had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm the man her father asked to take care of her." Mrs. Alvarez had looked at the paperwork, looked at Ronan, made a decision that technically violated 3 district policies and honored something more important than any of them. "She starts Monday." Avery started Monday. Mac drove her, not on a motorcycle, on a pickup truck he borrowed from the garage, cleaned with an obsessiveness that bordered on clinical, and equipped with a booster seat he'd purchased at a hardware store with the focused intensity of a man selecting engine components. He parked at the curb, watched her walk through the front doors, and sat in the truck for 10 minutes afterward, gripping the steering wheel, processing the unfamiliar architecture of an emotion he had not experienced in so long that he'd forgotten its name. It was pride. The specific, irrational, overwhelming pride of watching a child you are responsible for walk into a building with her head up and her backpack on and her stride steady, and knowing that you helped make that steadiness possible. He told no one about the 10 minutes. But Silas noticed that Mac's bourbon consumption, which had been a nightly ritual for over a decade, decreased that week, and the week after, and the week after that. Not to zero. Mac was not a man of dramatic transformations, but to a level that suggested the darkness was being displaced by something that took up room in the same space. The months passed. Elena grew stronger. The color returned to her face in stages, gray to pale to warm, like a photograph developing in slow motion. She gained weight. Her breathing improved. The oxygen concentrator, which had been her constant companion for over a year, was gradually reduced from continuous use to nighttime use to occasional use to a machine that sat in the corner of the bedroom unplugged, its silence a monument to recovery. She began cooking. Simple things at first: eggs, toast, the basic architecture of sustenance. Then more complex meals that filled the clubhouse with aromas it had never contained: garlic and onions and roasted chicken and the yeast and sugar smell of bread rising in a warm oven. Men who had eaten fast food and gas station sandwiches and bourbon for dinner for years found themselves sitting at the scarred table eating meals prepared by a woman who expressed gratitude not through words, but through the act of feeding. It was the oldest language, the most fundamental. And these men who understood loyalty and sacrifice in silence understood it immediately. Ronan watched the transformation, not just of Elena, but of the clubhouse itself. The building had always been functional, a headquarters, a gathering point, a fortress when necessary. It had never been a home. Now it was becoming one, through the accumulation of details so small they were almost invisible. A curtain on a window that had never had a curtain, a rug on a concrete floor, a drawing Avery had made, motorcycles and ravens, done in colored pencil with the confident imprecision of a child who drew for joy rather than accuracy, taped to the wall behind the table where club business was conducted. The Iron Ravens were not the same organization they had been. The national restructuring was ongoing, messy, contentious, incomplete. Some chapters had dissolved, others had broken away. The fabric of the club had been torn in places that would take years to mend, if they mended at all. But the Redfield chapter remained, smaller, quieter, changed in ways that Ronan could feel but not yet articulate, a shift in the center of gravity from performance to purpose, from what they appeared to be to what they actually were. Caleb visited once, 3 months after the arrests. He sat at the table with Ronan and drank coffee and looked at the drawing on the wall and said nothing for a long time. Phantom would have liked this, he finally said. Phantom should have been here. Yeah, he should have. They sat with that. 2 men in a room that smelled like coffee and leather, and faintly of bread cooling on a counter. The silence between them was comfortable, not the loaded silence of secrets, but the easy quiet of men who had survived something together and didn't need to narrate the survival. I've been thinking about retirement, Caleb said. You've been thinking about retirement since 2014. This time I mean it. You meant it in 2014 too, Caleb smiled. It changed his entire face. The accountant's austerity dissolving into something warmer, more human, the face of a man who had spent most of his life behind ledgers and spreadsheets, and who was only now considering the possibility that numbers weren't everything. Maybe I'll learn to cook, he said. Elena's offering lessons. You should see Mac with an apron. It's the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. The seasons turned. Spring came to Redfield. Not the cinematic spring of sudden bloom and warm breezes, but the actual spring of Northern California. Cold mornings, gray skies, mud in the yard, and the slow, grudging return of green to the hillsides beyond the town. The motorcycles came out of winter storage. Engines were tuned, tires checked, chains oiled. The sound of Harleys filled the weekends, not the massed thunder of a column riding in formation, but the individual rumble of men going about their lives, running errands, visiting friends, riding because riding was what they did and who they were and how they processed the world. Avery turned 10 in April. The party was held at the clubhouse, which Mac had decorated with a commitment that suggested he had never decorated anything before in his life, and was compensating with sheer volume. There were balloons. There were streamers. There was a cake that Elena had baked. Chocolate, 3 layers, slightly lopsided, magnificent. The candles numbered 10, and when Avery blew them out, the room full of bikers produced a collective cheer that rattled the windows. She got presents. A set of mechanics tools from Mac. Real ones, not toys, sized for small hands but professional grade. A stack of books from Silas, chosen with the careful attention of a man who understood that the right book at the right age could change the trajectory of a life. A leather-bound journal from Harlan, who had discovered a talent for leatherwork during the long winter and who had tooled the cover with a design of small ravens in flight. Ronan's gift was last. He set it on the table in front of her, a wooden box, hand-sanded, the grain visible beneath a coat of clear finish. Avery opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark cloth, lay a patch. Not an iron raven's patch, something new. A single raven in flight embroidered in black on a gray background, with 2 words beneath it in small, clean stitching, Phantom's daughter. Avery picked it up, turned it over, ran her thumb across the embroidery. The room was quiet. The particular quiet of men watching a child receive something that carries more weight than its physical dimensions suggest. It's not a club patch, Ronan said. It doesn't make you a member, doesn't come with obligations or rules or any of the complicated things we carry. It just means you belong. To us. Wherever you go, whatever you do, however far you ride, you belong here. With us. That's all. Avery looked at the patch, then at Ronan, then at the room. Mac with chocolate frosting on his beard, Silas with his eyes suspiciously bright, Tommy and Harlan grinning, Corbin standing in the back with his hands clasped, Dex leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw tight because he was fighting a losing battle against an emotion he refused to name. Thank you, she said. 2 words. Simple, direct, without elaboration. Her father's economy of language, inherited and instinctive. That evening, after the cake was eaten and the presents opened, and the bikers had filtered out into the spring night with their engines and their silence and their particular way of saying goodbye, which was to simply leave without announcement, Avery sat on the front step of the clubhouse with Ronan. The sky was darkening. Stars were appearing above the tree line. The air smelled like gasoline and cut grass, and the last traces of chocolate cake drifting from the open door behind them. "I'm going to be an engineer," Avery said. I decided. What kind? The kind that builds things. Engines, maybe, or bridges, something that moves or holds weight. You'd be good at that. Max says I have the hands for it. He showed me how to take apart a carburetor last week. I got it back together in 20 minutes. Did it work? First try, Ronan nodded. The pride he felt was not his to claim. She was not his daughter, not his responsibility in any legal or biological sense. But it filled him anyway, occupying space in his chest that had been vacant for years, displacing the guilt and the regret and the accumulated weight of mistakes with something lighter, something that had the particular quality of looking forward instead of back. Elena appeared in the doorway. She was standing without assistance. No oxygen, no tubing, no machine. Her hair was longer now, dark with streaks of early gray. Her face had filled out. Her eyes, Avery's eyes, Phantom's eyes, were clear and alert and held something that Ronan hadn't seen in them before. Not just survival, not just recovery. Something that looked, from certain angles, like the beginning of joy. "Come inside," she said. "There's coffee." They went inside. The clubhouse was warm. The lights were on. The scarred table held the remains of a birthday celebration. Crumbs and wrapping paper and the wooden box with the patch inside it, still open, the embroidered raven catching the light. On the wall behind the table, beside Avery's colored pencil drawing of motorcycles and ravens, Ronan had hung the Polaroid. The original, creased, faded, the image now split almost completely down the center, but held together by a strip of clear tape that Avery had applied with the precision of a surgeon. Two men laughing in sunlight. Brothers. One gone, one remaining. Both present. Elena poured coffee. Avery sat at the table with her mechanic's tools spread out in front of her, examining each one with the focused attention of someone cataloging instruments of future construction. Ronan sat in his usual chair, the one at the head of the table, where he'd presided over votes and arguments and confessions and betrayals and now birthday parties and quiet evenings and the unhurried routine of people who had chosen each other. Outside, the night deepened. The stars brightened. The yard was empty except for the motorcycles parked in their row. Chrome cooling, engines still, metal ticking faintly in the dropping temperature. They looked like sleeping animals. Patient, ready, waiting for morning and the road and the next mile. Somewhere beyond the fence, beyond the town, beyond the hills that ringed Redfield like cupped hands, a single motorcycle engine started. Distant, barely audible. A low rumble that rose and fell and rose again as the rider shifted gears and accelerated into the dark. Avery looked up from her tools, listened. The sound faded, not disappeared, but diminished, moving away. Becoming part of the landscape, part of the frequency of the night, indistinguishable from wind and distance in the vast California dark. She went back to her tools. The coffee steamed, the light held. The house, because that's what it was now, not a clubhouse, not a headquarters, not a fortress, but a house, a home, a place where people lived, settled into its evening quiet. And on the table, between the coffee cups and the mechanic's tools and the birthday crumbs, the Polaroid of two men laughing sat in its frame of clear tape, the crease down the center no longer a division, but a seam, the place where two halves of a broken image had been joined together by the hands of a child who understood, with the clarity that only children possess, that the things worth keeping are the things worth repairing. The engines in the yard ticked their final count and went silent. The road waited. It always did.